Plutarch's Lives Volume 1, Plutarch. The Dryden Clough edition of Plutarch's Parallel Lives pairs 14 Greek and Roman biographies with their corresponding comparisons, presenting a moral portrait gallery of the classical world. This forensic examination reconstructs Plutarch's method, character as the organizing principle, anecdote as evidence, comparison as judgment, and traces the moral architecture that governs each pair. Abstract. Plutarch's Parallel Lives, as presented in the Dryden Clough edition, pairs 14 Greek and Roman biographies with their corresponding comparisons to construct a moral portrait gallery of the classical world. This forensic examination reconstructs Plutarch's method, character as the organizing principle, anecdote as evidence, comparison as judgment, and traces the moral architecture that governs each pair. The result is not a collection of biographies in a modern sense, but a sustained meditation on virtue, fortune, and the relationship between private character and public action. Each life is organized around a defining moral quality. Theseus's free will, Lycurgus's austerity, Aristides' justice, Philopoemen's soldierly virtue, Lysander's ambition, Sylla's ambition, Crassus's avarice. And each comparison tests the quality against its Roman counterpart, asking not who is greater, but what kind of greatness the age demanded. Executive summary. Central thesis. Plutarch's Parallel Lives operates on a single governing principle, that the character of a great man is revealed not in his victories, but in his private habits, his domestic arrangements, and his relationship to wealth, pleasure, and power. The comparison form, Plutarch's distinctive contribution to biographical literature, tests this principle by placing two men side by side and asking not who is greater, but what kind of virtue each age demanded. The result is a moral philosophy conducted through biography. Each pair constitutes an argument about the relationship between private character and public action, between fortune and merit, between the individual and the state. Foundational observations. The 14 pairs fall into four thematic groups. The founders, Theseus and Romulus, Lycurgus and Numa, Solon and Poplicola, establish the principle that political institutions are expressions of individual character, that the laws of a state reflect the soul of its lawgiver. The warriors, Themistocles and Camillus, Pericles and Fabius, Alcibiades and Coriolanus, Timoleon and Aemilius Paulus, Pelopidas and Marcellus, test the relationship between military genius and political wisdom, asking whether the qualities that win battles are the same qualities that govern states. The statesmen, Aristides and Marcus Cato, Philopoemen and Flamininus, explore the tension between public virtue and private life, showing that the man who serves the state may destroy his family, and the man who neglects the state may preserve his soul. The final pairs, Pyrrhus and Marius, Lysander and Sylla, Cimon and Lucullus, Nicias and Crassus, examine the consequences of ambition, avarice, and timidity, the vices that destroy great men from within. Significance and recommendation. The Parallel Lives remains indispensable not as historical source material, but as a work of moral philosophy. Plutarch's method, the use of anecdote as evidence, comparison as judgment, and private life as the revelation of public character, anticipates modern character analysis by 2 millennia. The reader who approaches these lives not as records of events, but as portraits of human character in its full moral weight, will find in them a guide to the conduct of life that no modern work has surpassed. The comparison form, in particular, offers a model of comparative judgment that is as relevant to contemporary moral reasoning as it was to the 2nd century of our era. Introduction. Plutarch and his editor. Arthur Hugh Clough's introduction to the Dryden translation frames the entire edition with a single interpretive thesis. Plutarch is a moralist, not an historian. His interest is less for politics and the changes of empires, and much more for personal character and individual actions and motives to action. Duty performed and rewarded, arrogance chastised, hasty anger corrected, humanity, fair dealing, and generosity triumphing in the visible or relying on the invisible world. This is not a biographical footnote. It is a reading instruction. The reader who opens these lives expecting precise chronology or political analysis will miss what Plutarch is actually doing. The reader who opens them expecting to encounter human character in its full moral weight will find exactly what they came for. Clough reconstructs Plutarch's life from the author's own scattered allusions. Born at Cunea in Boeotia around AD 45 or 50, educated at Athens under the philosopher Ammonius, a visitor to Egypt, a lecturer at Rome on public business, an archon in his native town, a priest of Apollo at Delphi, married to Timoxena, father of at least 5 children. The biographical outline is deliberately sparse. Clough draws it almost entirely from Plutarch's minor works, his essays, dialogues, and table talk, rather than from external sources. This is itself a rhetorical strategy. By building the portrait of Plutarch from Plutarch's own words, Clough establishes the author as a kind, domestic, moderate man who is loath to make less by the withdrawal of even one inhabitant of Chaeronea. The historical context Clough provides is equally deliberate. Plutarch lived in the best and happiest age of the great Roman imperial period, the reigns of Nerva, Trajan, and Hadrian, and his writings reflect the serener aspect and the better era, rather than the overpowering recollections of years past under the immediate present terrors of imperial wickedness, found in Roman writers like Tacitus and Juvenal. Clough argues that a simple Boeotian provincial, writing in a more universal language, may more faithfully represent the general spirit of the age than the metropolitan writers consumed by local grievances. This is a pointed claim. It places Plutarch's moral vision above the political anger of his Latin contemporaries. Clough directly confronts the main criticism of Plutarch, his inaccuracy. He concedes that Plutarch is careless about numbers, has a passion for anecdote, and is unfair to figures like Demosthenes and Pericles, whom he judges with inherited Platonic prejudices. But Clough refutes the idea that this is a fatal flaw. Plutarch's unhistorical treatment is a deliberate choice. He is constructing a picture, at least, of the best Greek and Roman moral views and moral judgments, not a modern critical biography. The lives are valuable not despite their unhistorical nature, but because of it. They preserve the historical tradition of his age, the way Greeks and Romans loved to believe about their warriors and statesmen of the past. The introduction also addresses Plutarch's philosophical worldview, his belief in daimons, or genii, beings of a middle nature between divine and human, who, having first been men and followed the strict rules of virtue, have purged off the grossness and feculency of their earthly being, are exalted into genii. This Platonizing framework, which connects the moral lives of great men to a larger cosmic order, pervades the lives and shapes Plutarch's understanding of virtue, fortune, and the relationship between character and fate. Clough quotes Dryden's analysis of this belief to establish that Plutarch's philosophy is not mere superstition, but a coherent moral theology. Moralist, not historian. Clough's central interpretive frame. Plutarch's purpose is moral instruction, not historical completeness. The lives should be read as portraits of character, not as records of events. The historical moment. Plutarch belongs to the serener aspect of the Antonine age, and his provincial perspective may be more representative of the empire's general spirit than the metropolitan anger of Tacitus and Juvenal. Daimonic theology. Plutarch's belief in daimons as intermediaries between divine and human connects the moral architecture of the lives to a larger Platonic cosmology. Quote, he is a moralist rather than an historian. His interest is less for politics and the changes of empires, and much more for personal character and individual actions and motives to action. Duty performed and rewarded. Arrogance chastised. Hasty anger corrected. Humanity, fair dealing, and generosity triumphing in the visible or relying on the invisible world. Quote, as a picture, at least, of the best Greek and Roman moral views and moral judgments, as a presentation of the results of Greek and Roman moral thought, delivered not under the pressure of calamity, but as they existed in ordinary times and actuated plain living people in country places in their daily life, Plutarch's writings are of indisputable value. Quote, "If in Plutarch's time it was too late to think of really faithful biographies, we have here the faithful record of the historical tradition of his age. This is what, in the 2nd century of our era, Greeks and Romans loved to believe about their warriors and statesmen of the past. The founders. Theseus. Theseus is the founder hero of Athens, and Plutarch presents him as the prototype of the virtuous citizen ruler, a man who unites strength of body with an equal vigor of mind, and who acts not from necessity, but from free will." The life opens with a remarkable methodological confession. Plutarch compares himself to geographers who crowd into the edges of their maps parts of the world which they do not know about, and admits that beyond the reach of probable reasoning, there is nothing but prodigies and fables. The only inhabitants are the poets and inventors of fables. Yet he proceeds anyway, because Theseus and Romulus are the natural pair. One peopled the beautiful and far-famed city of Athens, the other the father of the invincible and renowned city of Rome. The character portrait that emerges is organized around a single moral axis. Theseus as the man of free will, acting of his own motion for the sake of others. His lineage traces through both Erechtheus and Pelops, connecting him to the oldest blood of Attica and the royal house of the Peloponnesus. His grandfather Pythius was a man of the greatest knowledge and wisdom of his time, the teacher of Hippolytus, the author of the maxim, "Unto a friend suffice a stipulated price." When the oracle at Delphi gave Aegeus the obscure command to loose not the wineskin foot, it was Pythius who prevailed upon him, it is uncertain whether by persuasion or deceit, to lie with his daughter Aethra. The entire mythic apparatus of Theseus's birth, the hidden sword and shoes beneath the stone, the proving of his identity, establishes him as a hero whose legitimacy must be earned, not merely inherited. The labors on the road to Athens are presented not as a hero's tour, but as a series of moral victories. Plutarch gives competing versions of each encounter, Cenes, the Siron, Procrustes, and selects the one that best reveals Theseus's character. He rid Greece of terrible oppressors, before any of them that were relieved knew who did it. The detail is significant. Theseus acts anonymously, without expectation of reward, purely out of civic virtue. His voluntary offering for the tribute to Crete, thinking it but just not to disregard, but rather partake of the sufferings of his fellow citizens, is the moral turning point of the life. He offers himself without any lot, and all are struck with admiration for the nobleness and with love for the goodness of the act. The encounter with the Minotaur is deliberately left in multiple versions. Plutarch cites Philocris's rational account, Taurus as a cruel captain, not a literal monster, Aristotle's opinion that the youths spent the remainder of their days in slavery, and the poetic tradition of Ariadne's thread. The moral point is the same regardless of which version is true. Theseus volunteers where others would flee. The political achievements, the unification of Attica, Synarchismos, the division of the Commonwealth into 3 ranks, the institution of the Isthmian Games, reveal the statesman behind the hero. Plutarch emphasizes that Theseus was the first who, as Aristotle says, out of an inclination to popular government, parted with the regal power, and that Homer's use of people for the Athenians alone confirms this. The coin stamped with an ox, the pillar on the isthmus marking the boundary between Ionia and Peloponnesus, the invitation to all strangers. These are the acts of a founder who creates institutions, not merely wins battles. But the life turns dark. The rape of Helen and the expedition to the Amazons, both acts of the same will that freed Athens, become sources of domestic catastrophe. The Amazonian War, fought in the very city, and ending in a negotiated peace, leads to the death of Hippolyta. The marriage to Phaedra and the curse on Hippolytus bring odium with countrymen. The final exile to Syros, where Lycomedes led him up to the highest cliff of the island, on pretense of showing him from thence the lands that he desired, and threw him headlong down from the rock, is Plutarch's way of showing how the same freedom that made Theseus great ultimately destroys him. The Athenians later recovered his bones, and many of the soldiers believe they saw an apparition of Theseus in arms at Marathon, a hero who continues to protect his people even in death. Free will heroism. Theseus acts of his own motion, out of civic virtue rather than necessity, the defining distinction Plutarch draws between him and Romulus. Anonymous virtue. The labors on the road to Athens are performed without recognition. Theseus rids Greece of oppressors, before any of them that were relieved knew who did it. The Synoikismos, the political unification of Attica, and the parting with regal power. Theseus as the founder of democratic institutions, not merely a warrior. Quote, as geographers, socius, crowd into the edges of their maps parts of the world which they do not know about, adding notes in the margin to the effect that beyond this lies nothing but the sandy deserts full of wild beasts, unapproachable bogs, Scythian ice, or a frozen sea. So in this work of mine, in which I have compared the lives of the greatest men with one another, after passing through those periods which probable reasoning can reach to and real history find a footing in, I might very well say of those that are farther off. Beyond this there is nothing but prodigies and fables. The only inhabitants are the poets and inventors of fables. Quote, Theseus displaying not only great strength of body, but equal bravery and a quickness alike in force of understanding. His mother Aethra, conducting him to the stone, and informing him who was his true father, commanded him to take from thence the tokens that Aegeus had left, and sail to Athens. He without any difficulty set himself to the stone and lifted it up, but refused to take his journey by sea, though it was much the safer way. Quote, Theseus, thinking it but just not to disregard, but rather partake of the sufferings of his fellow citizens, offered himself for one without any lot. All else were struck with admiration for the nobleness and with love for the goodness of the act. Romulus. Romulus is the founder hero of Rome, and Plutarch presents him as the moral inverse of Theseus, a man whose greatness is inseparable from violence, whose institutions are built on a fratricide, and whose political achievements emerge not from free will, but from necessity. The life opens by cataloging the competing myths for the origin of Rome. Pelasgians, Trojans, Roma daughter of Italus, Romanus son of Ulysses, before settling on the account from Diocles of Peparethus as the most believed. This proliferation of origins is itself significant. Rome, unlike Athens, has no single clean founding story, and the multiplicity of accounts reflects the city's character as a synthesis of many peoples and many traditions. The mythic birth of Romulus and Remus, the Vestal Sylvia, the divine paternity of Mars, the wolf and the woodpecker, the shepherd Faustulus, is presented with Plutarch's characteristic methodological ambivalence. He acknowledges the dramatic and fictitious appearance of the story but defends it. The Roman power would hardly have reached so high a pitch without a divinely ordered origin, attended with great and extraordinary circumstances. This is not credulity, but a moral argument. The grandeur of Rome's achievements demands an equally grand beginning. The fratricide of Remus, which occurs when Remus leaps over the half-built wall in contempt, establishes the pattern that will govern the entire life. Romulus resolves every crisis through violence. Some say Romulus himself struck the blow, others that it was Celer, one of his companions. The ambiguity is deliberate, allowing the reader to choose how much guilt to assign the founder. The rape of the Sabine women is the central moral event of the life, and Plutarch presents it with extraordinary care. He does not moralize about the act itself. Instead, he shows its consequences. The Sabines march on Rome. The battle hangs in the balance. And then the women intervene. The daughters of the Sabines, who had been carried off, came running, in great confusion, some on this side, some on that, with miserable cries and lamentations, like creatures possessed, in the midst of the army and among the dead bodies. Their speech is the moral center of the entire work. We were ravished away unjustly and violently by those whose now we are. That being done, we were so long neglected by our fathers, our brothers, and countrymen, that time, having now by the strictest bonds united us to those we once mortally hated, has made it impossible for us not to tremble at the danger and weep at the death of the very men who once used violence to us. The result is not a moral resolution, but a political one. The two peoples merge, Tatius and Romulus rule jointly, and the city doubles in size. The rape becomes the founding act of a multicultural state. The institutional achievements, the Senate of 100 patricians, the three tribes, Ramanses, Tatianses, Lusres, the division of the people into curiae, are presented as Romulus's genuine contribution. But Plutarch notes that these institutions carry the stain of their origin. The patricians are chosen from the 100 most eminent men, but the city is populated by slaves and fugitives who poured into the asylum. The tension between the grandeur of the institutions and the baseness of their context is the defining paradox of Romulus's Rome. The disappearance of Romulus, the storm during a review of the army, the report that he was carried up to heaven by a whirlwind, the senators claim that he appeared to Proculus Julius, is Plutarch's way of resolving the life's central contradiction. A man who was both king and tyrant, who founded a republic by killing his brother, who built institutions on an act of mass violence, cannot simply die like other men. His apotheosis as Quirinus, the deified ancestor of the Roman people, elevates his violence in his sacred history. The day of his disappearance is called the Flight of the People, and the Nones of the Goats. The Romans still run out of the city and shout each other's names, imitating the panic of that moment. The founding violence is not forgotten, but ritualized. Necessity versus free will. Romulus acts to escape present servitude in a punishment that threatened him. Plutarch's distinction between him and Theseus is the moral axis of the entire pair. The fratricide. The murder of Remus establishes violence as the founding principle of Rome, a pattern that recurs in every generation of Roman history. The Sabine intervention. The women's speech is the moral heart of the life. Love transforms the victims of violence into the agents of peace. Quote, but the story which is most believed and has the greatest number of vouchers was first published, in its chief particulars, amongst the Greeks by Diocles of Peparethus, whom Fabius Pictor also follows in most points. Quote, when Remus knew the cheat, he was much displeased, and, as Romulus was casting up a ditch, where he designed the foundation of the city wall, he turned some pieces of the work to ridicule and obstructed others. At last, as he was in contempt leaping over it, some say Romulus himself struck him, others Celer, one of his companions. He fell, however, and in the scuffle Faustulus also was slain. Quote, we were ravished away unjustly and violently by those whose now we are. That being done, we were so long neglected by our fathers, our brothers, and countrymen. That time, having now by the strictest bonds united us to those we once mortally hated, has made it impossible for us not to tremble at the danger and weep at the death of the very men who once used violence to us. The comparison of Romulus with Theseus. The comparison of Romulus with Theseus is where Plutarch's moral philosophy becomes most explicit. The synkresis is not a debate, but a weighing. Plutarch does not argue that one is better than the other, but that they represent fundamentally different types of virtue, and that the difference between them is the difference between free will and necessity. The opening judgment is devastating. Theseus, out of his own free will, without any compulsion, when he might have reigned in security at treason and the enjoyment of no inglorious empire, of his own motion effected great actions, whereas Romulus, to escape present servitude and a punishment that threatened him, according to Plato's phrase, grew valiant purely out of fear and dreading the extremest inflictions, attempted great enterprises out of mere necessity. This is not a comparison of achievements, but of moral origins. The same acts, killing tyrants, founding cities, waging wars, carry entirely different moral weight, depending on whether they spring from virtue or from survival. Plutarch then proceeds through the specific episodes with surgical precision. Theseus's labors, Sciron, Cines, Procrustes, Coronetes, were performed for no wrong done to himself, but for the sake of others, and he rid Greece of terrible oppressors, before any of them that were relieved knew who did it. Romulus and Remus, by contrast, as long as they themselves suffered no ill by the tyrant, permitted him to oppress all others. The contrast between anonymous virtue and self-interested action is drawn with moral clarity. Theseus's greatest act was voluntary self-sacrifice, offering himself for the Cretan tribute, while Romulus's greatest act was a crime, the murder of Remus. The Battle of the Centaurs and the Amazonian War balanced the Sabine War and the killing of King Acron. But these are the works of a free man, not a fugitive. The comparison of their political failures is equally sharp. Both founders fell off, Theseus into popularity and Romulus into tyranny. The women of the Sabines intervene not because they love their husbands. The text is ambiguous about this, but because they were sorry to see so great and brave a man as Romulus destroyed, who was a man of an excellent and comely person. The verdict is not that one is better than the other, but that both fell short of the kingly ideal. Romulus had more of justice, and Theseus of humanity. This is Plutarch at his most characteristic. The judgment is always nuanced, always refuses the easy answer, and always points to the moral complexity of human greatness. Free will versus necessity, the defining distinction. Theseus acts from virtue, Romulus from survival. Same achievements, entirely different moral weight. Anonymous versus self-interested virtue. Theseus rids Greece of oppressors without recognition. Romulus and Remus permit tyranny so long as they themselves are safe. Justice versus humanity. Romulus had more of justice, he built institutions. Theseus had more of humanity, he acted for others. Quote, Theseus, out of his own free will, without any compulsion, when he might have reigned in security at treason in the enjoyment of no inglorious empire, of his own motion effected great actions, whereas the other, to escape present servitude and a punishment that threatened him, grew valiant purely out of fear. Quote, Romulus had more of justice, and Theseus of humanity. The lawgivers. Lycurgus. Lycurgus is not a man, but a lawgiver, and Plutarch presents his life as the blueprint for a state built entirely on discipline, austerity, and military virtue. The life opens with a confession of historical uncertainty. There is so much uncertainty in the accounts which historians have left us of Lycurgus, the lawgiver of Sparta, that scarcely anything is asserted by one of them which is not called into question or contradicted by the rest. The genealogies disagree, the chronologies are irreconcilable, and even the manner of his death is disputed. Yet Plutarch presses forward, adhering to those statements which are least contradicted and depending upon those authors who are most worthy of credit. The method is identical to the Theseus life. Uncertainty is acknowledged but not allowed to derail the moral portrait. The biographical frame is brief but significant. Lycurgus was the youngest son of Eunomus, king of Sparta. His father was stabbed to death while quelling a riot. His elder brother Polydectes died soon after, leaving Lycurgus himself as king. When he discovered that the queen, his sister-in-law, was pregnant, he immediately declared that the kingdom belonged to her issue and that he ruled only as guardian. The queen then offered to destroy the infant if Lycurgus would marry her, and he responded by feigning acceptance, while secretly arranging for the child to be born, educated, and eventually installed as king. This is the first revelation of Lycurgus's character, a man who renounces power for principle and who uses deception in the service of justice. The Senate of 28 elders, the Gerousia, was Lycurgus's first and most important reform, designed to solve the problem of political instability that had plagued Sparta since the time of Euripon. Plutarch describes it as a ballast in a ship, giving steadiness and safety to the commonwealth by creating a third body that would adhering to the king so far as to resist democracy, and on the other hand, supporting the people against the establishment of absolute monarchy. The Rhetra, the ancient oracle that Lycurgus brought from Delphi, established the Senate of 30 elders, the 2 kings included, and the assembly of the people, with the commons holding the final voice and decision. This is the institutional foundation of the Spartan mixed constitution, a balance of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy that Aristotle would later celebrate as the best form of government. The redivision of the lands was equally radical. Lycurgus divided all the territory of Laconia into 9,000 equal lots, and the city of Sparta into 30 villages, each with the same structure. The iron money, which replaced the old gold and silver coinage, was deliberately made heavy and cumbersome. They fetched a great quantity of wine for a very little money, and a moderate supply of provisions was equivalent to the expense of a banquet. The common mess halls, the Fidicia, were Lycurgus's most masterly stroke against luxury and the desire of riches. By forcing all citizens, rich and poor alike, to eat of the same bread and same meat, he took away from wealth its very nature of being wealth. The rich could no longer enjoy their abundance in private. They were compelled to share the same table as the poorest citizen, and in doing so lost the very motive for accumulation. The education of the young, the agoge, was the instrument by which Lycurgus forged the character of the state itself. From the age of 7, boys were enrolled in companies under the command of a young officer called the Irene and subjected to a regime of physical hardship, deprivation, and discipline. They slept on beds of rushes torn from the riverbank, ate a meager black broth, went barefoot, and were encouraged to steal food, punished not for stealing, but for being caught. The purpose was twofold: to build physical toughness and to cultivate cunning and self-reliance. The women, too, exercised naked in public processions, competing in running, wrestling, and the throwing of the quoit. Gorgo, wife of Leonidas, captured the Spartan attitude when a foreign lady told her that the women of Lacedaemon were the only women who could rule men. "With good reason," she said, "for we are the only women who bring forth men." Plutarch's moral judgment is embedded in the narrative itself. Lycurgus's institutions are presented not as a catalog of customs, but as a coherent system designed to produce a specific kind of human being, one who places the state above the self, discipline above comfort, courage above safety. The oath that the Spartans swore to obey his laws until his return, and Lycurgus's voluntary death in exile to make that oath permanent, is the final act of a lawgiver who understood that his greatest achievement was not a set of rules, but a transformation of character. The Drusilla, the Senate of 28 elders as a ballast in a ship, the institutional foundation of the Spartan mixed constitution. The Fidicia, the common mess halls as Lycurgus's most masterly stroke. By eating together, rich and poor alike lost the motive for accumulation. The agoge, state education from age 7, deprivation, discipline, and the cultivation of courage as the mechanism by which the state forges its citizens. Quote, "The third and most masterly stroke of this great lawgiver, by which he struck a yet more effectual blow against luxury and the desire of riches, was the ordinance he made, that they should all eat in common, of the same bread and same meat. For the rich, being obliged to go to the same table with the poor, could not make use of or enjoy their abundance, nor so much as please their vanity by looking at or displaying it." Quote, "After that you have built a temple to Jupiter Helianius, and to Minerva Helenia, and after that you have filed the people into fills, and obeyed them into obes, you shall establish a council of 30 elders, the leaders included." Quote, "He too, dying soon after, the right of succession, as everyone thought, rested in Lycurgus, and reign he did, until it was found that the queen, his sister-in-law, was with child, upon which he immediately declared that the kingdom belonged to her issue, provided it were male, and that he himself exercised the regal jurisdiction only as his guardian." Numa Pompilius. Numa Pompilius is the Roman Lycurgus, a lawgiver whose greatness lies not in founding a city, but in taming one. Where Lycurgus forged a state of warriors through discipline and deprivation, Numa forged a state of citizens through religion, peace, and the cultivation of the arts. The life opens with the same methodological uncertainty that characterizes the Lycurgus life. Historians disagree about the time of Numa's reign, whether he knew Pythagoras, and whether he was a man of Greek learning or of natural virtue. Plutarch notes that the Roman registers were lost when the city was sacked by the Gauls, and that the surviving genealogies were counterfeited to flatter and serve the humor of some men who wish to have themselves derived from some ancient and noble lineage. This is not a refutation, but a qualification. The biographer must proceed despite uncertainty, just as he did with Lycurgus. The biographical frame is deliberately sparse. Numa was a Sabine, descended from the ancient kings of that people. He was elected king after the death of Romulus not by conquest, but by choice. The Romans sent an embassy to him, begging him to accept the government, and he accepted only on the condition that they would first consult the gods by augury. The detail is significant. Where Romulus seized power through violence, Numa received it through religious sanction. His first act as king was to disband the lifeguard of 300 men that Romulus had maintained, saying he would not distrust those who put confidence in him, nor rule over a people that distrusted him. This is the founding gesture of his entire reign, the replacement of fear with trust, of force with consent. The institutions Numa created were designed to transform a city of warriors into a city of worshippers. He established the pontifices, the college of priests whose duty was to declare and interpret the divine law, and made himself their first head. He created the Vestal Virgins, charged with maintaining the eternal fire, and endowed them with extraordinary privileges, the power to make a will during their father's lifetime, the freedom to manage their own affairs without a guardian, and the right to pardon any criminal they met by chance on the way to execution. The Vestal who broke her vow was buried alive, the most severe punishment in Roman law, applied to the most sacred transgression. Numa's invention of the Vestal order is Plutarch's way of showing that religion, in the Roman context, is not a matter of private belief, but of public institution. The reform of the calendar was equally significant. Under Romulus, the Roman months ran to irregular lengths, some 20 days, some 35, and the year contained only 360 days. Numa, calculating the difference between the lunar and solar year at 11 days, added an intercalary month and reordered the entire calendar, placing January before March and giving each month a name and a dedication. The change from a war calendar to a peace calendar is the institutional expression of Numa's entire philosophy. January, named for Janus, the god of doors and beginnings, was placed before March, named for Mars, the god of war, because the arts and studies of peace are to be preferred before those of war. The Temple of Janus, with its 2 gates that stood open in wartime and closed in peacetime, was shut for 43 consecutive years during Numa's reign, the longest period of unbroken peace in Roman history. The character portrait that emerges is of a ruler who governed not by command, but by persuasion. Plutarch emphasizes that Numa set himself without delay to the task of bringing the hard and iron Roman temper to somewhat more of gentleness and equity. He did this through religion, sacrificing often, performing religious dances in person, filling their imaginations with religious terrors, and through the distribution of the people into guilds and trades, which obliterated the original and great distinction between Sabine and Roman. The result was a reign in which there was neither war, nor sedition, nor innovation in the state, nor any envy or ill will to his person, nor plot or conspiracy from views of ambition. This is Plutarch's portrait of the philosopher king that Plato described, a man who united the power of a king and the wisdom of a philosopher in a single person. Religion as governance. Numa's genius was to use religion not as a set of beliefs, but as an instrument of social transformation, turning a city of warriors into a city of citizens. The peace calendar, the reform of the Roman calendar, placing January before March, closing the gates of Janus, is the institutional expression of Numa's philosophy that peace is superior to war. The philosopher king. Plutarch presents Numa as the realization of Plato's ideal, a ruler whose virtue was so conspicuous that it brought the multitude spontaneously to virtue. Quote, "He therefore set himself without delay to the task of bringing the hard and iron Roman temper to somewhat more of gentleness and equity." Plato's expression of a city in high fever was never more applicable than to Rome at that time. Quote, "Those gates were never seen open a single day, but continued constantly shut for a space of 43 years together. Such an entire and universal cessation of war existed." Quote, "It is the praise of Numa that no one seems ever to have discerned this so clearly as he, that the sole and only hope of respite or remedy for human evils was in some happy conjunction of events which should unite in a single person the power of a king and the wisdom of a philosopher." The comparison of Numa with Lycurgus. The comparison of Numa with Lycurgus is the most structurally unusual of the syncrasias, because Plutarch does not weigh the two subjects against each other so much as reveal the philosophical architecture that unites them. Both are lawgivers. Both used religion as the instrument of social transformation, and both left their states in a condition of extraordinary virtue and stability. But the differences are equally striking. Lycurgus created a state of warriors by discipline and deprivation. Numa created a state of citizens by religion and peace. Together, they represent the two paths by which law can transform human character. The opening judgment is remarkable for its directness. Plutarch names the two cities and then immediately draws the contrast. Lycurgus found Sparta in anarchy and left it in military order. Numa found Rome in the aftermath of fratricide and left it in moral harmony. Lycurgus used iron money and common mess halls to eliminate luxury. Numa used religious festivals and the arts to cultivate gentleness. The methods are opposite, but the goal is identical: to create a state in which virtue is not merely permitted but practiced, and in which the citizens are shaped by their institutions rather than left to the disorder of their passions. Plutarch then draws a philosophical distinction that goes beyond the merely biographical. Lycurgus, he says, was the author of a philosophic state, a state in which the citizens practiced the virtues of temperance, courage, and obedience not as abstract principles but as daily habits. Numa, by contrast, was the author of a philosophic rule, a state in which the king himself was the model of virtue, and in which the citizens were brought to goodness not by compulsion, but by the mere sight of a shining and conspicuous example. The distinction is between legislation and inspiration, between law and example, between the teacher who creates a curriculum and the sage whose life is the lesson. The comparison concludes with a judgment that is characteristically Plutarchian. Neither is better than the other, but both are necessary. The philosopher king and the philosopher lawgiver represent two faces of the same ideal: the idea that human institutions can be designed to produce human virtue. Plutarch does not say which is more difficult or which produces better results. He simply presents them as the twin pillars of the ancient political tradition and leaves the reader to weigh them. Discipline versus inspiration. Lycurgus created virtue through external compulsion: iron money, common mess halls, the agoge. Numa created virtue through internal persuasion, religion, example, the arts of peace. The philosopher state versus the philosopher king. Lycurgus built a state that practiced philosophy. Numa was a philosopher who ruled a state. The distinction is between institutional design and personal charisma. War versus peace. Both founders transformed their cities, but in opposite directions. Lycurgus turned a disordered kingdom into a military machine. Numa turned a military machine into a peaceful commonwealth. Quote, Lycurgus and Numa, both being lovers of the people, the one did not use violence, the other did not need force. Quote, It is the praise of Numa that no one seems ever to have discerned this so clearly as he, that the sole and only hope of respite or remedy for human evils was in some happy conjunction of events which should unite in a single person the power of a king and the wisdom of a philosopher. The statesman. Solon. Solon is the archetypal statesman lawgiver, a man who saved his city not by force, but by persuasion, who pleased neither party because he served justice rather than faction, and whose laws endured for centuries precisely because they were moderate. Plutarch presents him as a member of the middle class, neither rich nor poor, who was chosen as arbitrator and lawgiver because he alone was not implicated in the troubles. He had not joined in the exactions of the rich, nor was he involved in the necessities of the poor. This is the defining feature of Solon's character. He stood between the factions, holding his shield of might over both, and let neither touch the other's right. The biographical frame establishes Solon as a man who valued knowledge over wealth. His father had ruined his estate in doing benefits and kindnesses to other men, and Solon, though he had friends enough that were willing to contribute to his relief, yet was ashamed to be beholden to others, so he applied himself to merchandise in his youth. The merchant life gave him experience of the world, but his poetry reveals a mind that transcended commerce. Wealth I would have, but wealth by wrong procure I would not. Justice, e'en if slow, is sure. This is the moral conviction that governs everything he does as lawgiver. The encounter with Croesus at Sardis is Plutarch's way of crystallizing this wisdom. When the king of Lydia asked if he had ever known a happier man than himself, Solon named Tellus, a private citizen who died bravely in battle, and Cleobus and Biton, two brothers who drew their mother's wagon to the temple of Juno and died in their honor. The gods, O king, have given the Greeks all other gifts in moderate degree, Solon replied, and when Croesus was later bound upon the funeral pyre and cried out, O Solon, 3 times, the philosopher's warning was vindicated. Happiness cannot be judged until the end of life. The crisis that Solon was called to resolve was dire. Athens was divided into 3 factions: the hill, democracy; the plain, oligarchy; and the seaside, mixed government. And the disparity of fortune between rich and poor had reached its height. All the people were indebted to the rich. Plutarch explains, they either tilled the land for their creditors, paying 1/6 of the increase, or engaged their bodies for debt and might be seized, and either sent into slavery at home or sold to strangers. Some were forced to sell their children, others fled the country. The city was in a truly dangerous condition, and no other means for freeing it from disturbances and settling it to be possible but a despotic power. Solon's solution was the Sysaxia, the shaking off of burdens, the cancellation of debts, and the prohibition of debt slavery. The mortgage stones that covered her, by me removed, he wrote, the land that was a slave is free. This was not a redistribution of land, the rich kept their estates, but a liberation of persons, the most radical and the most moderate reform possible simultaneously. The constitutional reforms that followed were equally measured. Solon divided the citizens into 4 property classes: the Pentacosumedimni, the Hippias, the Zeugatai, and the Vites, and assigned political privileges according to wealth rather than birth. He preserved the Areopagus as a council of former archons and created a new council of 400 to inspect all matters before they reached the assembly. He allowed the Vites, who held no office, to act as jurors, which at first seemed nothing, but afterwards was found an enormous privilege, as almost every matter of dispute came before them in this latter capacity. The laws themselves were deliberately obscure. He was obscure and ambiguous in the wording of his laws, on purpose to increase the honor of his courts, a calculated strategy to make the judiciary, not the legislature, the final arbiter of the city's disputes. The moral portrait that emerges is of a man whose greatness lies not in any single achievement, but in the balance of his character. He was a poet who used verse to justify his own actions, and sometimes to correct, chastise, and stir up the Athenians to noble performances. He was a statesman who refused the tyranny that both parties offered him, because he believed that where those that are not injured try and punish the unjust as much as those that are, the truest mark of a well-governed city. And he was a philosopher who, in old age, sailed to Egypt and Cyprus, hoping that by that time his laws would have become familiar, a lawgiver who trusted his institutions enough to leave them to their own working. The middle way. Solon pleased neither party because he stood between them, neither redistributing land like the radicals nor restoring debt bondage like the conservatives. The Sysaxia, the shaking off of burdens, the cancellation of debts and prohibition of debt slavery, was Solon's most radical act, yet executed with a minimum of violence. The Croesus story. The encounter with the richest king in the world is Plutarch's way of showing that Solon's wisdom transcended politics. It was a philosophy of human finitude. Quote, "Formerly they boasted of me vainly. With averted eyes now they look askance upon me. Friends no more, but enemies." Quote, "The gods, O king, have given the Greeks all other gifts in moderate degree. And so our wisdom, too, is a cheerful and a homely, not a noble and kingly wisdom. And this, observing the numerous misfortunes that attend all conditions, forbids us to grow insolent upon our present enjoyments, or to admire any man's happiness that may yet, in course of time, suffer change." Quote, "Such power I gave the people as might do, abridged not what they had, now lavished new. Those that were great in wealth and high in place my counsel likewise kept from all disgrace. Before them both I held my shield of might, and let not either touch the other's right." Publicola. Publius Valerius is the Roman Solon, a man who founded a republic not by law-giving, but by personal example, whose greatest act was pulling down his own house because the people thought it looked too much like a palace. Where Solon saved Athens through legislation, Valerius saved Rome through character, through the deliberate cultivation of humility as a political instrument, and through the transformation of personal power into public trust. Plutarch introduces him as a man of wealth who deployed his riches with a twofold liberality, charitably employing the one in liberal aid to the poor, the other with integrity and freedom in the service of justice. This is the portrait of a man who understood that in a republic, the great must make themselves small if the small are to be free. The biographical frame establishes Valerius as the man who exposed the conspiracy of the Vitellii and Aquileia, the plot to restore Tarquin to the throne. A slave named Vindicius, hiding accidentally in the house where the conspirators met, overheard their plans and brought them to Valerius, whose known freedom and kindness of temper made him the natural repository for such a dangerous secret. Valerius seized the letters, dragged the conspirators into the forum, and stood by as Brutus condemned his own sons to death. A scene of republican virtue so extreme that Plutarch presents it without comment, letting the act speak for itself. When Collatinus, the other consul, was found to be compromised by his kinship to the Tarquins, Valerius did not move against him directly, but allowed the people's suspicion to drive him from office, a political tact that reveals his understanding of how republics must handle their own. The confrontation with the people's suspicion is the moral heart of the life. When the Romans complained that Valerius's house on the Velia was too stately, too much like a palace, too much like a king's residence, Valerius did not defend himself or argue his case. He sent for workmen in the night and pulled the house down. In the morning the people, seeing and flocking together, expressed their wonder and their respect for his magnanimity, and their sorrow, as though it had been a human being, for the large and beautiful house, which was thus lost to them by an unfounded jealousy. The act is the founding gesture of Roman republican politics, the voluntary sacrifice of private luxury for public trust. The people rewarded him with the name Publicola, people lover, which Plutarch says had the preeminence of the rest of his many names. The institutional reforms were equally deliberate. Valerius parted the axes from the rods and lowered the fasces before the assembly, the physical gesture that announced the end of monarchy and the beginning of the republic. He enacted laws granting the right of appeal from the consul's judgment to the people, making it death to usurp any magistracy without the people's consent, and relieving poor citizens of their taxes. He established the Temple of Saturn as the public treasury and created the office of quaestor, two young men chosen by the people to manage the state's finances. Each reform was designed to distribute power away from the consul and toward the people, without destabilizing the new government. The comparison with Solon that Plutarch invites is implicit but unmistakable. Both men were called to save their cities from internal crisis. Both chose the middle path, neither tyrant nor revolutionary. Both understood that the legitimacy of the new order depended not on force, but on consent. But where Solon's achievement was institutional, laws that endured for centuries, Valerius's achievement was personal. He created the model of the Republican magistrate, the great man who makes himself servant of the people. The temple of Vica Pota, built where his modest house once stood, stands as the permanent memorial of this founding act. The house on the Velia, Valerius's demolition of his own palace, is the founding gesture of Roman republican politics, the voluntary sacrifice of private luxury for public trust. The fasces, parting the axes from the rods and lowering them before the assembly, the physical gesture that announced the end of monarchy. The name Publicola, people lover, the name the people gave him, the highest honor a republican can receive. Quote, he resolved to render the government, as well as himself, instead of terrible, familiar and pleasant to the people, and parted the axes from the rods, and always, upon his entrance into the assembly, lowered these also to the people, to show, in the strongest way, the republican foundation of the government. Quote, but the humility of the man was but a means, not, as they thought, of lessening himself, but merely to abate their envy by this moderation. For whatever he detracted from his authority, he added to his real power, the people still submitting with satisfaction, which they expressed by calling him Publicola, or people lover. Quote, whatever he detracted from his authority, he added to his real power, the people still submitting with satisfaction, which they expressed by calling him Publicola, or people lover, which name had the preeminence of the rest. The comparison of Publicola with Solon. The comparison of Publicola with Solon is the shortest and most fragmentary of the syncrasias in this volume, and Plutarch himself seems to acknowledge this. The two men are natural counterparts, both statesmen who saved their cities through moderation, both who refused tyranny when it was offered, both who stood between the factions as impartial arbiters. But where Solon's achievement was legislative, the creation of laws that would endure for centuries, Publicola's was martial and personal. He defended the new republic through 3 consulships, defeated the Etruscans at the bridge, and negotiated a peace with Porcina that preserved Roman independence without sacrificing Roman honor. The structural contrast is revealing. Solon created institutions, Publicola defended them. Solon sailed away, trusting his laws to their own working. Publicola stayed, fighting wars and suppressing conspiracies. The difference is partly temperamental. Solon was a philosopher who wrote poetry and traveled to Egypt. Publicola was a warrior who charged the enemy at the bridge and died of his wounds. But it is also a difference of circumstance. Athens in Solon's day was threatened by internal division. Rome in Publicola's was threatened by external conquest. The same virtue, moderation, manifests differently depending on whether the danger is civil strife or military invasion. Plutarch draws the parallel most sharply in their handling of personal power. Solon refused the tyranny that both parties offered him. Publicola demolished his own house because the people thought it looked too much like a palace. Both understood that in a republic, the great must make themselves small, but Solon did it through legislation. His laws restrained the rich and empowered the poor, while Publicola did it through personal sacrifice. He gave up his house, his wealth, and ultimately his life for the new government. The comparison is not about who was greater, but about how the same moral principle, that power must serve the people, not the powerful, takes different forms in different circumstances. Institution versus defense. Solon created the laws. Publicola defended the republic. Both were necessary, and neither could have succeeded without the other. Moderation in different registers. Solon's moderation was legislative, the middle path between rich and poor. Publicola's was personal, the voluntary sacrifice of luxury for trust. The philosopher and the warrior. Solon sailed to Egypt. Publicola died of wounds at the bridge. The philosopher trusts his institutions. The warrior defends them with his body. Quote, but the humility of the man was but a means, not, as they thought, of lessening himself, but merely to abate their envy by this moderation. For whatever he detracted from his authority, he added to his real power, the people still submitting with satisfaction, which they expressed by calling him Publicola, or people lover. The warriors and statesmen. Themistocles. Themistocles is the supreme example of the great man who cannot survive the city he saved. Plutarch presents him as the man who saved Greece from Persia at Salamis, and then was banished from Athens by the very people he had freed. The life opens with a deliberate assertion of his obscure origins. The birth of Themistocles was somewhat too obscure to do him honor. His mother was a foreign woman. Phanias says Euterpe of Caria, Neanthes says of Halicarnassus, and as illegitimate children had to attend the Cynosarges, a wrestling place dedicated to Hercules, himself of half-blood among the gods. Themistocles persuaded several of the young men of high birth to accompany him to anoint and exercise themselves together, an ingenious device for destroying the distinction between the noble and the baseborn. This is the first revelation of his character, a man who understands that social hierarchy is a construction and who uses charm and intelligence to break it down. His youth was marked by impetuousness and ambition. His master warned him that, "You, my boy, will be nothing small, but great one way or other, for good or else for bad." The warning proved prophetic. Themistocles was not a philosopher or a poet, but a man of action. He boasted that he could not make use of any stringed instrument, could only, were a small and obscure city put into his hands, make it great and glorious. He studied not with the natural philosophers, but with Nicephorus the Phrygian, a man who practiced a sort of political shrewdness and practical sagacity, the art of making things happen, not the art of understanding them. His early experiments were uneven. He followed mere natural character, which, without the control of reason and instruction, is apt to hurry, upon either side, into sudden and violent courses. His own metaphor is the best. The wildest colts make the best horses if they only get properly trained and broken in. The defining episode of his career is the Battle of Salamis. When the Persian armada arrived, the Greeks were in disarray. The Peloponnesians wanted to retreat to the isthmus. The Athenians wanted to fight at sea. Themistocles resolved the crisis by yielding his own command to Eurybiades the Spartan, persuading the Athenians to submit. If in this war they behaved themselves like men, he would answer for it after that the Greeks, of their own will, would submit to their command. This is the paradox of the man. He is the most ambitious and self-serving of the Greek commanders, yet he makes the crucial concession that saves Greece. When the Peloponnesians resolved to flee, Themistocles sent the Persian captive Sisinus to Xerxes with a false message that the Greeks were about to escape and that the king should attack them at once. The stratagem trapped the Persian fleet in the narrow straits of Salamis, where the Greek galleys, low-built and maneuverable, could fight effectively against the high-decked, cumbrous Persian ships. The result was a total victory, that noble and famous victory, than which neither amongst the Greeks nor barbarians was ever known more glorious exploit on the seas. After Salamis, Themistocles' ambition became his undoing. He proposed to burn the Greek fleet in the haven of Pegasae, and Aristides reported this to the Athenians as no proposal could be more politic or more dishonorable. He built a temple to Diana of best counsel, intimating thereby that he had given the best counsel not only to the Athenians, but to all Greece, and he reminded the citizens of his services with such frequency that they became weary of him. The ostracism that followed was, Plutarch explains, not so much to punish the offender, as to mitigate and pacify the violence of the envious, who delighted to humble eminent men. Themistocles was driven into exile, eventually reaching the court of Artaxerxes in Persia, where he died. The man who had saved Greece from Persia ended his life as a guest of the Persian king. The moral portrait is one of the most complex in Plutarch. Themistocles is not a villain, but a man whose virtues and vices are inseparable. His ambition saved Greece at Salamis. The same ambition destroyed him at Athens. His political skill unified the Greeks against Persia. The same skill made him too powerful for Athens to tolerate. The contrast with Aristides, the just, whom Themistocles banished, is drawn throughout the life, but Plutarch does not choose between them. Both are necessary, both are incomplete, and the tension between them is the tension of Greek civic life itself. The obscure birth. Themistocles was not of noble blood, and his early life was marked by ambition and impetuousness. The wildest colts make the best horses when properly trained. Salamis. The stratagem of Sisinus and the false message to Xerxes trapped the Persian fleet in the narrow straits. The most consequential deception in Greek history. The ostracism. Banished by the people he had saved. The man who saved Greece from Persia ended his life as a guest of the Persian king. Quote, "You, my boy, will be nothing small, but great one way or other, for good or else for bad." Quote, he certainly could not make use of any stringed instrument, could only, were a small and obscure city put into his hands, make it great and glorious. Quote, "The wildest colts make the best horses if they only get properly trained and broken in." Camillus. Marcus Furius Camillus is the man who saved Rome twice and was banished by it once. Plutarch opens with a paradox that defines the entire life. Among the many remarkable things that are related of Furius Camillus, it seems singular and strange above all, that he, who continually was in the highest commands and obtained the greatest successes, was 5 times chosen dictator, triumphed 4 times, and was styled the second founder of Rome, yet never was so much as once consul. The reason was structural. The people, growing powerful through the tribunes, opposed the aristocracy, and Camillus, as a patrician of the highest rank, could never hold the office that the commons most coveted. The tension between personal merit and political fact is the axis of the life. A man who embodied the best of Rome was never permitted to hold its highest office. The siege of Veii is the first major episode, and Plutarch narrates it as a story of divine intervention and human perseverance. The city was the head city of Tuscany, not inferior to Rome, either in number of arms or multitude of soldiers, and the siege lasted 10 years, the first time the Romans were compelled to winter in the field. The Alban Lake, which in the absence of rain began visibly to rise and swell, increasing to the feet of the mountains, was interpreted by a captured diviner as a sign that the lake must be diverted from the sea before Veii could fall. Camillus, chosen dictator in the 10th year of the war, cut mines beneath the city, and when the Roman soldiers emerged inside the citadel, at the very moment the Etruscan priest declared that victory would go to whoever completed the sacrifice, they snatched the entrails and carried them to Camillus. The fall of Veii was the great military triumph of Camillus's early career, and it was accompanied by a moral crisis. When the city was taken and the soldiers fell to pillaging, Camillus, from the high tower, viewing what was done, at first wept for pity, and then he began to pray that the gods might spare him from such riches, saying that he feared the glory of his victory more than he feared the enemy. The sack of Rome by the Gauls is the turning point of the life. Camillus had been banished by his political enemies through a charge of peculation, a calumny, and was living in exile at Ardea. When Brennus and the Gauls took Rome, burned the city, and besieged the capital, Camillus began to rouse himself from his private life. He found the Ardeatians lacking not men, but enterprise, through the inexperience and timidity of their officers, and he persuaded the young men that the event had been only an evidence of the power of fortune, that Rome's fall was not a failure of courage, but a failure of leadership. In a night attack on the Gaulish camp, Camillus struck the enemy while they slept in drunkenness, and the slaughter was complete. The Romans who had escaped to Veii, hearing of this, cried out, "O heavens! What a commander has Providence bereaved Rome of." They sent for Camillus, and he was recalled as dictator. The restoration of Rome is the climax of the life. When Camillus entered the capital, he wept, not for the city that had been lost, but for the citizens who had survived. Plutarch records that when the tribune Pomponius demanded the surrender of the sacred virgins, Camillus was so enraged that he struck the man dead with his own hand, a deed, the justice and necessity whereof was afterward acknowledged, when the tribunes were compelled to pass a law granting dictators the power to punish citizens by death. The city was rebuilt on the same site, and Camillus's title as second founder of Rome was earned not through a single dramatic act, but through the slow, patient work of restoring institutions, refilling the citizen body, and persuading the survivors that Rome was not destroyed but merely displaced. The moral portrait is of a man whose greatness lies in his relationship with fortune. Plutarch presents Camillus as a man who was not free from the popular jealousy, who was repeatedly honored and repeatedly banished, who won triumphs and was charged with peculation, who saved Rome and was exiled by it. The contrast with Themistocles is implicit. Both men were too great for their cities to tolerate, but Themistocles ended his life in exile at the Persian court, while Camillus ended his as the second founder of Rome. The difference is partly temperamental. Camillus was more patient, more willing to endure injustice, more rooted in the Roman tradition of public service, and partly structural. Rome, unlike Athens, had institutions that could absorb and eventually vindicate a great man. The paradox of the dictator. Camillus held the highest military commands, but never the consulship. The tension between personal merit and political fact defines the life. The sack and the return, banished for peculation, recalled to save Rome from the Gauls. The man who was exiled became the city's second founder. The weeping dictator. Camillus wept not for the city, but for the citizens. The distinction between the state and its people is the moral heart of the life. Quote, "Among the many remarkable things that are related of furious Camillus, it seems singular and strange above all, that he, who continually was in the highest commands and obtained the greatest successes, was 5 times chosen dictator, triumphed 4 times, and was styled the second founder of Rome, yet never was so much as once consul." Quote, "He began to speak with the young men, first to the effect that they ought not to ascribe the misfortune of the Romans to the courage of their enemy, nor attribute the losses they sustained by rash counsel to the conduct of men who had no title to victory. The event had been only an evidence of the power of fortune." Quote, "O heavens, what a commander has Providence bereaved Rome of." Pericles. Pericles is the supreme example of the great statesman whose power was so immense that the comic poets compared him to a tyrant, and whose integrity was so absolute that the people never believed them. Plutarch opens with a characteristically Plutarchian anecdote. Caesar, seeing wealthy foreigners at Rome carrying puppies and monkeys in their arms, asked whether the women of their country were not used to bear children. The analogy was pointed. Pericles had Athens, and Athens had him, and the city was so devoted to its leader that it seemed to forget it had other citizens. But the comparison with a tyrant is immediately qualified. Pericles, unlike Pisistratus, never seized power by force. He maintained it for 40 years through the sheer force of his character, his eloquence, and his incorruptibility. The biographical frame is deliberate. Pericles was of the noblest birth. His father Xanthippus defeated the Persians at Mycale. His mother Agariste was the granddaughter of Clisthenes, who drove out the sons of Pisistratus and settled the Athenian democracy. His mother dreamed that she was brought to bed of a lion, and he was born with a head somewhat longish and out of proportion. The comic poets called him Skynocephalos, squill head, and Cratinus described him as the son of old Cronos and Queen Sedition. But the long head was the organ of the most formidable mind in Athens. Plutarch traces his education through 3 teachers. Damon the musician, whose lyre was a blind for his political expertise, Zeno the Eleatic, who taught him the art of refuting opponents, and above all Anaxagoras of Clazomenae, whom the men of those times called nous, mind. From Anaxagoras, Pericles derived not natural philosophy, but political character, a composure of countenance, and a serenity and calmness in all his movements, which no occurrence whilst he was speaking could disturb, a sustained and even tone of voice. When a vile and abandoned fellow reviled him all day long in the marketplace, Pericles continued his business in perfect silence, and in the evening ordered a servant to take a light and see the man safely home. The political career was defined by a single paradox. Pericles was a democrat who governed like a monarch. Plutarch records that for 40 years he maintained the first place among statesmen, and for 15 consecutive years held the office of general, the only office he ever sought. His power rested not on force, but on persuasion. He used hopes and fears as his 2 chief rudders, with the one to check the career of their confidence at any time, with the other to raise them up and cheer them when under any discouragement. The source of this predominance was not merely his power of language, but the reputation of his life and the confidence felt in his character, his manifest freedom from every kind of corruption and superiority to all considerations of money. Despite making Athens as great and rich as can be imagined, he did not make the patrimony his father left him greater by 1 drachma. The building program was Pericles' most visible achievement and his most controversial. The Parthenon, the Odeum, the Propylaea, these were constructed with the common treasure of the Greeks, removed from the Isle of Delos. His enemies cried out that Greece cannot but resent it as an insufferable affront, and consider herself to be tyrannized over openly, when she seized the treasure, which was contributed by her upon a necessity for the war, wantonly lavished out by us upon our city, to gild her all over, and to adorn and set her forth, as it were some vain woman. Pericles' defense was that the allies were in no way obliged to give any account of those moneys, so long as they maintained their defense and kept off the barbarians. The building program employed the whole city, with their variety of workmanship and of occasions for service, which summon all arts and trades and require all hands to be employed about them. They do actually put the whole city, in a manner, into state pay. Phidias had the oversight of all the works. Callicrates and Ectinus built the Parthenon, and the Odeum was constructed in imitation of the king of Persia's pavilion. The plague and the death of Pericles' sons brought the life to its tragic conclusion. Plutarch narrates the epidemic with the careful detail of a moralist who wants the reader to understand that even the greatest statesman cannot control fortune. Pericles lost his sister and his legitimate sons, Xanthippus and Perillus, within a single plague, and when he placed the funeral garland on the body of his last surviving son, he wept for the first and only time before the people. The contrast with his usual composure, the unshakable calm that Anaxagoras' philosophy had taught him, is Plutarch's way of showing that philosophy, however lofty, cannot entirely overcome the natural affections of a father. His death was mourned as the end of an era. The good fortune of Athens had risen and come to its maturity with him, and with him declined and decayed. The long head, Pericles' physical deformity, his elongated skull, became the comic poet's favorite target, but housed the most formidable political mind in Athens. The unbroken composure, the story of the marketplace abuse, Pericles' silence in the face of vilification, his request that a servant light the man home, is Plutarch's portrait of philosophical politics. The building program, the Parthenon, the Odeum, the Propylaea, constructed with allied treasure, defended by the argument that Athens earned the right to beautify itself by defending Greece. Quote, he continued his business in perfect silence, and in the evening returned home composedly, the man still dogging him at the heels and pelting him all the way with abuse and foul language. And stepping into his house, it being by this time dark, he ordered one of his servants to take a light and to go along with the man and see him safe home. Quote, with their variety of workmanship and of occasions for service, which summon all arts and trades and require all hands to be employed about them, they do actually put the whole city, in a manner, into state pay, while at the same time she is both beautiful and maintained by herself. Quote, for every particular piece of his work was immediately, even at that time, for its beauty and elegance, antique, and yet in its vigor and freshness looks to this day as if it were just executed. There is a sort of bloom of newness upon those works of his, preserving them from the touch of time, as if they had some perennial spirit and undying vitality mingled in the composition of them. Fabius Maximus is the man who saved Rome by doing nothing, or rather, by doing nothing that Hannibal wanted him to do. Plutarch presents him as the Roman Pericles, a man whose apparent dullness concealed a profound understanding of politics, war, and human nature. In youth, his slow movements and easy submission to everyone made those who judge superficially of him, the greater number, esteem him insensible and stupid, and few only saw that this tardiness proceeded from stability and discerned the greatness of his mind and the lion-likeness of his temper. The metaphor is precise. Fabius was a lion, patient, watchful, and devastating when he finally struck. But the strike, when it came, was not a single dramatic blow. It was the slow, grinding refusal to give Hannibal the pitched battle that the Carthaginian general needed to destroy Rome. The crisis came after the disaster at Lake Thrasymene, where Flaminius, impetuous, contemptuous of augury, convinced that he would never suffer the advance of the enemy to the city, marched straight into Hannibal's trap and was killed with 15,000 of his men. The news arrived at Rome through the praetor Pomponius, who caused the people to assemble, and without disguising or dissembling the matter, told them plainly, "We are beaten, O Romans, in a great battle. The consul Flaminius is killed. Think, therefore, what is to be done for your safety." The choice fell on Fabius. His age gave him experience without taking from him the vigor of action, and his temper was a happy compound of confidence and cautiousness. He was installed dictator with the full body of 24 lictors, and his first act was religious, to remind the people that their overthrow had come not from lack of courage, but from neglect of divine ceremonies. The strategy that followed was a revolution in Roman military thinking. Fabius encamped always on the highest grounds, where the enemy's horse could not reach him. He followed Hannibal when the Carthaginians marched, and encamped when they did, but always at such a distance as not to be compelled to an engagement. He wore out and wasted the vigor of his arms by lapse of time, meeting his want of resources by superior means, by large numbers the smallness of his forces. Hannibal, recognizing the danger of this patient strategy, resorted to stratagem. He drove 2,000 oxen with torches bound to their horns through the night, creating the illusion of an advancing army. The Roman sentinels, seeing flames appearing to come from men advancing with torches, abandoned their posts, and Hannibal's army slipped through the passes. Fabius discovered the trick, but for fear of ambush in the dark, kept his men to their arms all night. The next morning he attacked Hannibal's rear, but was repulsed by the Spaniards. The obloquy was immense. They said he was not only inferior to his adversary, as they had always thought, in courage, but even in that conduct, foresight, and generalship by which he had proposed to bring the war to an end. The most revealing episode is the conflict with Minucius. When Fabius was called to Rome by the priests, he left the army to his master of horse, Minucius, beseeching him not to engage the enemy. Minucius immediately sought battle, and after a skirmish in which he drove a Hannibal detachment back to their camp, the Roman people were highly elated. The tribune Metilius extolled Minucius's valor and accused Fabius of want not merely of courage, but even of loyalty. The people decreed that Minucius should have equal authority with the dictator, a thing then without precedent. Fabius submitted with what Plutarch calls invincible patience. He submitted to what happened and contributed a proof to the argument of the philosophers that a just and good man is not capable of being dishonored. When Minucius, now emboldened, fell into Hannibal's ambush at Geronium and was nearly destroyed, Fabius marched to his rescue. The scene that followed was extraordinary. Minucius went forth to meet Fabius, laid his standards at his feet, calling him with a loud voice his father, while the soldiers with him saluted the soldiers here as their patrons. After silence was obtained, Minucius said, "You have this day, O dictator, obtained 2 victories, one by your valor and conduct over Hannibal, and another by your wisdom and goodness over your colleague. By one victory you preserved, and by the other instructed us." The contrast with Varro and the disaster at Cannae completes the portrait. Varro, a man of obscure birth, but very popular and bold, had the custom to declaim that as long as Rome employed generals like Fabius, there never would be an end of the war. He would that same day free Italy from the strangers. Fabius warned the other consul, Aemilius Paulus, "It is more reasonable that you should believe me than Varro in matters relating to Hannibal, when I tell you that if for this year you abstain from fighting with him, either his army will perish of itself, or else he will be glad to depart of his own will." Paulus replied, "Did I only consider myself, I should rather choose to be exposed to the weapons of Hannibal than once more to the suffrages of my fellow citizens. Yet since the cause of Rome is at stake, I will rather seek in my conduct to please and obey Fabius than all the world besides." But Varro prevailed, and at Cannae 88,000 Romans were destroyed. The disaster proved Fabius right, and his strategy, though abandoned, was vindicated by the very catastrophe that followed from rejecting it. The Cunctator, Fabius's nickname, the delayer, was intended as mockery, but became his glory. He saved Rome by refusing to fight on Hannibal's terms. The rescue of Minucius. The scene at Geronium, Minucius laying his standards at Fabius's feet, calling him father, is Plutarch's portrait of the dignity of patience rewarded. The warning at Cannae. Fabius's counsel to Aemilius Paulus. If for this year you abstain from fighting with him, either his army will perish of itself, was the wisest speech of the war, and it was ignored. Quote, his reputed want of energy then was recognized by people in general as a freedom of passion. His slowness in words and actions, the effect of a true prudence. His want of rapidity and his sluggishness as constancy and firmness. Quote, you have this day, O dictator, obtained 2 victories, one by your valor and conduct over Hannibal, and another by your wisdom and goodness over your colleague. By one victory you preserved, and by the other instructed us. Quote, it is more reasonable that you should believe me than Varro in matters relating to Hannibal, when I tell you that if for this year you abstain from fighting with him, either his army will perish of itself, or else he will be glad to depart of his own will. The comparison of Fabius with Pericles. The comparison of Pericles and Fabius is the longest and most detailed of the Syncrasias in this volume, and Plutarch clearly considered it the most important. The reason is structural. Both men faced the same fundamental challenge: how to govern a free people who did not understand what was good for them, and both solved it in the same way, by patience, by personal incorruptibility, and by the sheer force of character over eloquence. Plutarch draws the parallel explicitly. Both men were slow, both were patient, both were incorruptible, and both were hated by the very people they saved. The contrast in military temperament is the most striking difference. Pericles was a man of peace who fought wars only when he had to, and only on terms he chose. His strategy against Sparta was defensive. He refused pitched battle, withdrew behind the long walls, and relied on the Athenian fleet to ravage the Peloponnese. Fabius did exactly the same against Hannibal. He refused battle, kept to the hills, and wore down the Carthaginian army by time and attrition. The parallel is precise, and Plutarch makes it deliberate. Pericles told the Athenians that trees, when they are lopped and cut, grow up again in a short time, but men, being once lost, cannot easily be recovered. Fabius told Aemilius Paulus that if they abstain from fighting Hannibal for 1 year, either his army will perish of itself, or else he will be glad to depart of his own will. Both counsels were wise, and both were ignored, Pericles by the plague, Fabius by Varro at Cannae. The comparison of their relationship with their fellow citizens reveals a deeper parallel. Both were accused of cowardice for pursuing a defensive strategy. Pericles was called a satyr king who always handled words instead of swords. Fabius was called timid and pusillanimous for refusing to fight. Both endured the attacks of demagogues, Pericles with Cleon, Fabius with Metilius, and both submitted with what Plutarch calls invincible patience. The most revealing moment in Fabius's life is his response to being made equal in authority with Minucius. He submitted to what happened and contributed a proof to the argument of the philosophers that a just and good man is not capable of being dishonored. Pericles, after being reviled all day in the marketplace, asked a servant to light the abusive man home. The philosophical composure is the same. Both men understood that the anger of the multitude is a weather phenomenon, not a moral judgment. But Plutarch also draws a crucial difference in the scale of their achievements. Pericles built the Parthenon, the Odeum, the Propylaea, monuments that made Athens the most beautiful city in Greece. Fabius had no such building program. His monuments were the battles he did not fight. Plutarch records that Pericles made the city of Athens, which was great of itself, as great and rich as can be imagined, and that Fabius, by contrast, saved Rome by preventing the destruction that would have made building impossible. The distinction is between creation and preservation. Pericles adorned Athens while it was safe. Fabius kept Rome safe so that it could be adorned. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. The final point of comparison is the manner of their deaths. Pericles died of plague, weakened by grief over his sons. The philosopher who had taught Athens the virtue of composure was himself overcome by the natural affections of a father. Fabius died at a great age, still active in public affairs, having just delivered a funeral oration for his son. The patient, deliberate man who had outweighted Hannibal was himself outweighted by nothing. Plutarch's judgment is balanced. Both were great, both were necessary, and both were examples of the same fundamental virtue: the willingness to endure unpopularity for the sake of the common good. The parallel strategy: both Pericles and Fabius refused pitched battle and relied on time and attrition, and both were accused of cowardice for it. The incorruptible character: both men remained unspotted by corruption in the exercise of immense power. Pericles did not increase his patrimony by 1 drachma. Fabius sold his own land to ransom Roman prisoners when the Senate refused. Creation versus preservation: Pericles built the Parthenon. Fabius saved the city that built it. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. Quote, "You have this day, O dictator, obtained 2 victories, one by your valor and conduct over Hannibal, and another by your wisdom and goodness over your colleague. By one victory you preserved, and by the other instructed us." Quote, "It is more reasonable that you should believe me than Varro in matters relating to Hannibal, when I tell you that if for this year you abstain from fighting with him, either his army will perish of itself, or else he will be glad to depart of his own will." Quote, "For no Athenian, through his means, ever wore mourning." Alcibiades. Alcibiades is Plutarch's supreme example of the brilliant man whose gifts are indistinguishable from his vices. He was the most beautiful, the most charming, the most brilliant, and the most destructive man of his age, and Plutarch presents all 4 qualities as aspects of a single character. Alcibiades, as it is supposed, was anciently descended from the family of Eurysaces, the son of Alcmaeon, and his mother Deinomake was of the house of the Alcmaeonids. His guardian was Pericles, but his true master was Socrates, who loved him for his beauty and tried to save him from his nature. Plutarch records that Socrates saw in this impetuous and fiery nature a spirit capable of great things and apprehensive of dishonor, and that he resolved to guide the young man. But the guidance failed. Alcibiades was the student who never learned the lesson, the lover who never returned the love, the citizen who never served the city that made him great. The early episodes reveal the character in embryo. When he was a boy playing in the street, a rich man named Eposthenides asked him to stop throwing stones at him. Alcibiades replied, "Will you stop then?" And when the man said yes, the boy threw 1 more stone. When a tutor tried to make him write the sentence, Alcibiades the handsome, he refused to continue the exercise, saying, "I am not handsome when I am writing." When he was playing knucklebones in the street and a loaded cart was approaching, he stood in the way, and when the driver cursed and threatened him, he stripped off his clothes and said, "Now you have the choice whether to move or to fight me." The driver was so intimidated that he apologized and turned the cart aside. Plutarch records these episodes not as charming anecdotes, but as evidence of a fundamental character trait. Alcibiades could not tolerate any form of constraint, whether physical, moral, or political. The Sicilian expedition is the central catastrophe of a life. Alcibiades persuaded the Athenians to invade Sicily, arguing that the expedition would bring glory, wealth, and empire. But before he could lead it, he was recalled on charges of impiety. Rather than return, he defected to Sparta, then to Persia, then back to Athens, serving each state in turn, betraying each in turn, and enriching himself at every stage. Plutarch narrates this with the careful detail of a moralist who wants the reader to understand that the capacity for self-destruction is the obverse of the capacity for greatness. The Sicilian expedition, which destroyed Athens, was Alcibiades' creation, and when the expedition failed, Athens exiled the very man who had created it. The irony is complete. The city that should have benefited from his genius was destroyed by it, and the man who should have saved it helped to ruin it. The moral portrait is of a man who could not be content. Plutarch records that when Alcibiades was in power at Athens, he was surrounded by sycophants. When he was in exile, he lamented that no one came to visit him. He was generous when he had nothing, and cruel when he had everything. He was loved by Socrates and hated by the city. He was worshipped by the soldiers and despised by the philosophers. His death was as characteristic as his life. He was murdered by the Spartans at Phrygia, after being lured into a trap by a woman named Timandra. The supreme athlete of politics, the man who had outplayed Pericles, Alcibiades, and Lysander, was killed by a courtesan's treachery. The impetuous boy, the cart incident, Alcibiades stripping off his clothes and challenging the driver, is Plutarch's portrait of the character that would define his career. The Sicilian catastrophe, the expedition that destroyed Athens, was Alcibiades' creation, and when it failed, Athens exiled the man who had created it. The three defections, Alcibiades served Athens, Sparta, and Persia in turn. The man who could not be loyal to any city was loyal only to himself. Quote, Alcibiades, as it is supposed, was anciently descended from the family of Eurysaces and the son of Cleinias from the city of Scambonity. Quote, he was so carried away and enslaved by the passion of glory and of power that, judging the same things to be honorable and dishonorable which the city judged, and thinking nothing unjust or terrible but the loss of his citizens, he was ready to embrace and to counsel any measure that might serve the interests of Athens. Quote, thus the Sicilian expedition, so great a matter and so much canvassed at Athens, was resolved upon chiefly by the efforts of one young man. Coriolanus. Caius Marcius is the Roman aristocrat who loved his city so much that he destroyed it, or rather, who loved his own honor so much that he could not bear the city's ingratitude. Plutarch presents him as the moral inverse of Alcibiades, where Alcibiades was brilliant, charming, and disloyal. Marcius was brave, austere, and relentlessly patriotic, until the moment when patriotism failed him. The life opens with a genealogy of the patrician house of the Marcii, tracing it back to Ancus Marcius, grandson of Numa. Marcius was left an orphan and brought up under the widowhood of his mother Volumnia, and Plutarch notes that his early loss of a father did not prevent him from becoming either virtuous or eminent. Evidence, as Plutarch sees it, that true goodness depends not on fortune, but on nature. The defining quality of Marcius was his physical courage, which Plutarch describes with the admiration of a man who understood the power of the body in the ancient world. He was so swift in running that he could outstrip his companions in armor, and so strong in combat that he was invariably in the front rank. When the Romans besieged the Volscian city of Corioli, Marcius flew out with a slender company, cut down those who first engaged him, and called upon the Romans with a voice and look that of themselves were a terror to the enemy. He was twice awarded the grass crown, the highest military honor in Rome, for saving the lives of fellow citizens in battle. His mother wept for joy when she received him, and his wife, at her request, bore him children. But Marcius never ceased to live with his mother, and his tenderness to her was the one softness in an otherwise granite character. The crisis came with the grain distribution. When the Roman common people, oppressed by debts and the cruelty of moneylenders, seized the Holy Mount and seceded from the city, Marcius opposed any concession. He denounced the tribunes as demagogues, called the people's demands the first step toward open revolt, and when the Senate eventually granted the people their protectors, Marcius continued to insult and provoke them. When he was elected consul, He vetoed the grain laws, and the tribunes impeached him. Marcius responded with fury. He called the tribunes the most wicked and seditious of all the people, declared that the common people had no more right to the consulship than the patricians had to the plebeian offices, and when the tribunes ordered him to appear before the people, he cursed them and said he would not submit. The tribunes declared him an enemy of the people, and Marcius was banished. The exile became a Volscian general. The same man who had destroyed Corioli now led the Volscians against Rome, and Plutarch narrates this transformation with the precision of a moralist who understands that patriotism and self-love are closely allied. Marcius told the Volscians that he would serve them not for their sake, but because Rome had wronged him. And when he had taken all the Roman towns and stood at the gates of the city itself, his mother Volumnia, his wife Virgilia, and the priestess Valeria came to him in the camp. Plutarch records the scene with devastating simplicity. The three women fell before him in silence, and Marcius, after a long struggle, yielded. He withdrew the Volscian army, and for this act of mercy, or this final act of self-destruction, he was put to death by the Volscians, who considered his withdrawal a betrayal. The moral portrait is of a man whose virtues and vices were inseparable. Marcius was brave, austere, devoted to his mother, incorruptible by money, and yet he was incapable of tolerating the slightest dissent, incapable of understanding the needs of the poor, incapable of recognizing that a city is not a military camp, but a community of interests. He was, in Plutarch's phrase, a man of a generous and worthy nature, but that nature was poisoned by the very pride that made it great. The contrast with Alcibiades is precise. Both men were exiled by their cities, both served the enemy against their own people, and both were destroyed by the consequences of their own character. But Alcibiades was destroyed by his appetites, and Marcius was destroyed by his pride, and Plutarch, characteristically, does not tell us which is worse. The grass crown. Marcius was twice awarded the highest military honor in Rome for saving fellow citizens. The patriot who saved Rome from the enemy was exiled by the people he saved. The exiles return. The scene at the gates of Rome, Volumnia, Virgilia, and Valeria falling before Marcius in silence, is Plutarch's portrait of the moment when private love conquers public hatred. The pride of the patrician, Marcius's refusal to yield any ground to the common people, his insistence that the tribunes had no authority, that the people had no right to share in government, was the direct cause of his exile and his destruction. Quote, "Of all the numerous wars and conflicts in those days, there was not one from which he returned without laurels and rewards." Quote, "And whereas others made glory the end of their daring, the end of his glory was his mother's gladness, the delight she took to hear him praised and to see him crowned, and her weeping for joy in his embraces rendered him in his own thoughts the most honored and most happy person in the world." Quote, he called the tribunes the most wicked and seditious of all the people, declaring that it was not in the power of the commons to be the worse for it, though they should pass still more unjust and insolent laws, but that they who had authority to transgress them would be found the worse. The comparison of Alcibiades with Coriolanus. The comparison of Alcibiades and Coriolanus is one of Plutarch's most psychologically penetrating syncrasies, because both men were exiled from their cities and both served the enemy against their own people. Yet the motives and the manners were entirely different. Plutarch draws the parallel with deliberate precision. Both were patriots who became traitors. Both were soldiers who fought against the cities they had served, and both were destroyed by the consequences of their own character. But Alcibiades was destroyed by his appetites, and Coriolanus was destroyed by his pride, and Plutarch's judgment is that pride is the more fatal disease. The contrast in social skill is the most striking difference. Alcibiades possessed what Antipater called the gift of persuasiveness. He could charm anyone, adapt to any company, and make himself indispensable to any city. Coriolanus had none of this. Pride and self-will, the consort, as Plato calls it, of solitude, made him insufferable. Alcibiades was repeatedly recalled to office despite having harmed Athens repeatedly. Coriolanus stood in vain for the position that his great services had earned. The one, in spite of the harm he occasioned, could not make himself hated, nor the other, with all the admiration he attracted, succeeded in being beloved by his countrymen. The asymmetry is Plutarch's way of showing that political skill is not merely a convenience, but a moral necessity. The man who cannot persuade cannot govern. The contrast in their relationship with money reveals a deeper difference in character. Alcibiades was often guilty of procuring it by accepting bribes and spent it ill in luxury and dissipation. Coriolanus declined to receive it, even when pressed upon him by his commanders as an honor, and his opposition to the grain laws was motivated not by avarice, but by pride and insolence, the conviction that the common people had no right to share in government. Plutarch's moral is precise. Coriolanus's integrity was genuine but fatal because it made him incapable of the compromise that democratic politics requires. Alcibiades' corruption was equally fatal, but in a different way. It made him unreliable but never made him unpopular. The climax of the comparison is Plutarch's judgment on Coriolanus's final decision. When Volumnia, Virgilia, and Valeria came to the camp and fell before him in silence, Coriolanus withdrew the Volscian army. But Plutarch argues that this was not a virtue, but a further expression of pride. He yielded to his mother's entreaties while refusing the public supplications of ambassadors and the prayers of priests. He saved Rome not for its own sake, but for his mother's sake. To concede all as a private favor to his mother was less an honor to her than a dishonor to the city which thus escaped, in spite, it would seem, of its own demerits through the intercession of a single woman. The retreat was less an honor to her than a dishonor to the city, and it was this act, not his victories, that cost him his life among the Volscians. The final point of comparison is character. Plutarch ends with a balanced judgment. For his temperance, continence, and probity he claims to be compared with the best and purest of the Greeks. Not in any sort or kind with Alcibiades, the least scrupulous and most entirely careless of human beings in all these points. Coriolanus was morally superior to Alcibiades in every private virtue, and morally inferior to him in every public one. The comparison is Plutarch's way of showing that private virtue without public grace is not merely insufficient, but actively dangerous. The charm and the pride. Alcibiades could make anyone love him. Coriolanus could make no one love him, and both men were destroyed by this asymmetry. The mother's plea. Coriolanus yielded to Volumnia while refusing public supplications. Plutarch argues this was not virtue, but a further expression of pride. Private virtue, public failure. Coriolanus was temperate, continent, and incorruptible, and his virtues made him insufferable. Quote, "The one, in spite of the harm he occasioned, could not make himself hated, nor the other, with all the admiration he attracted, succeeded in being beloved by his countrymen." Quote, "He retreated without listening to the persuasions of his opponents or asking the consent of his friends. The origin of all lay in his unsociable, supercilious, and self-willed disposition, which in all cases is offensive to most people, and when combined with a passion for distinction passes into absolute savageness and mercilessness." Quote, "For his temperance, continence, and probity he claims to be compared with the best and purest of the Greeks. Not in any sort or kind with Alcibiades, the least scrupulous and most entirely careless of human beings in all these points. The liberators and conquerors. Timoleon. Timoleon is Plutarch's portrait of the reluctant liberator, the man who killed his own brother to save his city, and who freed Sicily from tyranny with a force so small that Fortune herself seemed to be the real commander. Plutarch opens with a remarkable statement of purpose. "It was for the sake of others that I first commenced writing biographies, but I find myself proceeding and attaching myself to it for my own. The virtues of these great men serving me as a sort of looking-glass, in which I may see how to adjust and adorn my own life." Timoleon's virtue was of the rarest kind, the willingness to sacrifice personal happiness for public good, and the grace to do it without claiming credit for it. The defining episode of Timoleon's early career was the killing of his brother Timophanes. Timophanes was a soldier of great courage, but no principle, who abandoned all regard to honor and equity, and declared himself tyrant of Corinth. Timoleon tried to reason with him twice. When reason failed, he stood weeping with his face covered while two others drew their swords and dispatched him. The act was celebrated by the better Corinthians as proof that Timoleon preferred that which is good and just before gain and interest in his own particular advantage. But it destroyed him morally. His mother cursed him and shut her doors against him. He attempted to starve himself to death, and when his friends prevented him, he withdrew in his solitude, wandering up and down the fields, full of anxious and tormenting thoughts. Plutarch's moral is precise. An action must proceed not only from a just principle, but from a lasting one, where the doer will be overcome by remorse. Timoleon's justice was genuine, but his conscience could not bear it. The Sicilian expedition is the great story of the life. Timoleon arrived at Syracuse with 1,000 soldiers and no money. The Corinthians had sent him because he was the only man willing to go, and because, as Plutarch notes, some god or other, it might rather seem, had put it in the man's heart to mention him. His first success was the recovery of the citadel of Syracuse and the expulsion of Dionysius, accomplished within 50 days. The campaign that followed was a masterpiece of improvisation. Timoleon defeated Hycetes at Adranum with 1,200 men against 5,000. He forced the Carthaginians to grant terms at the river Crymesis, and he rebuilt Syracuse as a free city, recalling exiles from all over Sicily and Italy. Plutarch records that he sent for citizens from Corinth and colonies from the rest of Greece, and invited people from all quarters to come and inhabit, and that he was the only liberator in history who freed a city and then went home. The moral portrait is a man whose relationship with fortune was unique. Timoleon never claimed credit for his victories. When the Syracusans honored him with a statue and a house in the agora, he accepted them as gifts from the city, not as rewards for himself. Plutarch records that when Dionysius the tyrant was brought to Corinth and a stranger asked him what profit he had derived from Plato's philosophy, he replied, "Do you think I have made no profit of his philosophy when you see me bear my change of fortune as I do?" But Timoleon's bearing of fortune was the true philosophical achievement, not Dionysius's. The man who had freed Sicily ended his days in obscurity, blind and content, having shown that the highest form of courage is not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage to relinquish power. The killing of Timophanes. The scene, Timoleon standing weeping with his face covered while his brother is slain, is Plutarch's portrait of the moral cost of justice. The 1,000 men. Timoleon arrived at Syracuse with a force so small that the Carthaginians laughed, and within 50 days he had expelled the tyrant and freed the citadel. The blind old man. Timoleon ended his days blind and content, having shown that the highest form of courage is the courage to relinquish power. Quote, "It was for the sake of others that I first commenced writing biographies, but I find myself proceeding and attaching myself to it for my own. The virtues of these great men serving me as a sort of looking-glass, in which I may see how to adjust and adorn my own life." Quote, "He was noted for his love of his country and his gentleness of temper, except in his extreme hatred to tyrants and wicked men." Quote, "He withdrew into solitude, wandering up and down the fields, full of anxious and tormenting thoughts, and spent his time in desert places at the farthest distance from society and human intercourse." Aemilius Paulus. Lucius Aemilius Paulus is Plutarch's portrait of the ideal Roman aristocrat, the man who served the Republic with complete integrity, who enriched no one but himself least of all, and who understood that the highest function of a general is not to win battles, but to maintain the discipline and character of the army that fights them. Plutarch opens with a genealogy of the Aemilii, one of the most ancient patrician houses in Rome, tracing it back to Mamercus, son of Pythagoras. Most of this race that have risen through their merit to reputation also enjoyed good fortune, and even the misfortune of Lucius Paulus at Cannae gave testimony to his wisdom and valor, for he kept the field and died fighting when his colleague fled. The defining quality of Emilius was his relationship with religion. He was elected augur and so carefully studied the ancient customs of his country and so thoroughly understood the religion of his ancestors that this office, which was before only esteemed a title of honor and merely upon that account sought after, by this means rose to the rank of one of the highest arts. He performed every ceremony with meticulous exactness, never omitting any detail, and he argued that any laxity in religious observance was a dangerous precedent for the Commonwealth. No man ever began the disturbance of his country's peace by a notorious breach of its laws, and those who are careless in trifles give a precedent for remissness in important duties. This was not mere piety, but political wisdom, the conviction that the rituals that bind a community together are not optional, but essential. The Macedonian campaign is the great story of the life. Emilius was elected consul at an advanced age and given command against Perseus, king of Macedonia. He told the people frankly that if they wanted a commander who would flatter them, they should choose someone else, but if they wanted a general, they should supply him with means and assistance and leave him to fight. The Battle of Pydna was a masterpiece of military judgment. Emilius recognized that the Macedonian phalanx, with its bristling wall of sarissas, was impregnable from the front, but vulnerable on the flanks and in the broken ground. He divided his legions, sent them into the gaps, and destroyed the phalanx piecemeal. Plutarch records that when Perseus, defeated and abject, threw himself at Emilius's feet, the Roman general arose with tears in his eyes and said, "Why, unhappy man, do you thus take pains to exonerate fortune of her heaviest charge against her, by conduct that will make it seem that you are not unjustly in calamity?" The moral portrait is of a man who understood the proper relationship between fortune and virtue. After the victory, Emilius sat in silence with his friends for a long time, and then began to discourse of human affairs. Is it meet for him that knows he is but man, in his greatest prosperity to pride himself, and be exalted at the conquest of a city, nation, or kingdom, and not rather well to weigh this change of fortune, in which all warriors may see an example of their common frailty? He had been struck by the death of two of his sons, one killed in the Spanish Wars, one at the Battle of Pydna, and Plutarch records that he bore these losses with the same composure that he bore his victories. He enriched no one by the war. He returned to Rome, not having increased his patrimony by a single drachma. The augur's religion. Emilius transformed the office of augur from a mere title of honor into a genuine science of religious observance, and argued that carelessness in trifles is the precedent for remissness in important duties. The Battle of Pydna. Emilius recognized that the Macedonian phalanx was impregnable from the front, but vulnerable on the flanks, and he divided his legions into the gaps and destroyed it piecemeal. The silence after victory. After defeating Perseus, Emilius sat in silence for a long time, and then spoke of the mutability of fortune. The conqueror who understood that victory is not a reward for virtue, but a test for it. Quote, "Is it meet for him that knows he is but man, in his greatest prosperity to pride himself, and be exalted at the conquest of a city, nation, or kingdom, and not rather well to weigh this change of fortune, in which all warriors may see an example of their common frailty, and learn a lesson that there is nothing durable or constant?" Quote, he desired to be brought to Emilius, who arose from his seat, and, accompanied with his friends, went to receive him with tears in his eyes, as a great man fallen by the anger of the gods and his own ill fortune. Quote, "Why, unhappy man, do you thus take pains to exonerate fortune of her heaviest charge against her, by conduct that will make it seem that you are not unjustly in calamity, and that it is not your present condition, but your former happiness, that was more than your deserts?" The comparison of Timoleon with Emilius Paulus. The comparison of Timoleon and Emilius Paulus is one of Plutarch's shortest and most balanced syncrasias, because the two men had so much in common that there was very little to distinguish them. Both freed cities from tyrants. Both conquered powerful enemies. Both remained uncorrupted by the immense wealth they might have claimed, and both bore their victories with a philosophical composure that Plutarch clearly admired. The only real question, as Plutarch frames it, is which of the two accomplished more with less. The military comparison favors Timoleon on the grounds of proportion. Emilius commanded a well-disciplined Roman army against Perseus, whose forces were already weakened by his own cowardice and parsimony. Timoleon freed Sicily from multiple tyrants and defeated a powerful Carthaginian army with an inconsiderable force of volunteers drawn from all parts. Men who were, as Plutarch notes, unskilled in fighting and ungovernable. When actions are equally glorious, Plutarch argues, the greatest esteem is certainly due to that general who conquers with the small power. But the argument is balanced by the counterpoint that Emilius faced Perseus when his forces were entire, while Timoleon found Dionysius in a despairing condition, and that Emilius's army was the product of a disciplined state, while Timoleon's was a ragged band of volunteers. Plutarch leaves the question open. The contrast in integrity is more subtle. Both men were scrupulously honest, but Emilius's integrity was the product of the Roman state's discipline and customs, while Timoleon's was the product of his own character. Emilius had the advantage of being, from his infancy, by the laws and customs of his country brought up to the proper management of public affairs, which Timoleon brought himself to by his own efforts. And this is plain. At that time, all the Romans were uniformly orderly and obedient, while not one of the Greek generals commanding in Sicily could keep himself uncorrupted, except Dion and Timoleon. The implication is that Emilius's virtue was partly institutional, while Timoleon's was entirely personal, and that personal virtue, exercised in a corrupt environment, is the more remarkable achievement. The final point of comparison is the manner of bearing fortune. Emilius maintained the same noble and lofty countenance even after the death of two dear sons as when he achieved his greatest victories. Timoleon, after punishing his brother, let his reason yield to a causeless sorrow, and humiliated with grief and remorse, forbore for 20 years to appear in any public place, or meddle with any affairs of the commonwealth. Plutarch is sympathetic but clear. It is truly very commendable to abhor and shun the doing any base action, but to stand in fear of every kind of censure or disrepute may argue a gentle and open-hearted, but not an heroic temper. The distinction is between the courage that faces public censure and the sensitivity that cannot bear it, and Plutarch ranks the former above the latter. The question of proportion. Timoleon conquered with less, Emilius with more. Plutarch argues that the general who conquers with a smaller force deserves the greater esteem. Institutional versus personal virtue. Emilius's integrity was shaped by Roman customs. Timoleon's was entirely his own work, and personal virtue in a corrupt environment is the more remarkable achievement. Bearing fortune. Emilius bore the death of two sons with the same composure as his victories. Timoleon withdrew from public life for 20 years after killing his brother. Quote, when actions are equally glorious, and the means to compass them unequal, the greatest esteem is certainly due to that general who conquers with a small power. Quote, it is truly very commendable to abhor and shun the doing any base action, but to stand in fear of every kind of censure or disrepute may argue a gentle and open-hearted, but not an heroic temper. Pelopidas. Pelopidas is Plutarch's portrait of the soldier-patriot who died as he lived, in the act of defending liberty, at the head of the sacred band he had made famous. Plutarch opens with an extended digression on the proper relationship between valor and the risk of death, citing Cato Major's distinction between prizing valor at a great rate and valuing life at little. The digression is not incidental. It is the moral framework for both the Pelopidas and the Marcellus, because both men were great soldiers who died through their own rashness, and Plutarch wants the reader to understand that the courage which risks a general's life is not the same as the courage that wins a battle. The defining quality of Pelopidas was his friendship with Epaminondas. Where Epaminondas was the philosopher and the strategist, Pelopidas was the man of action. He excelled in bodily exercises, spent his spare hours in hunting and the palestra, and devoted all his time to the public good. He ruined his estate by his liberality. When his friends admonished him, he pointed to a blind cripple named Nicodemus and said, "Yes, necessary to Nicodemus." He married a woman of good family and had children, yet still thought little of his private interests. But the friendship with Epaminondas was the foundation of everything. Plutarch records that if he then cast his eye on the kindness and reverence that Pelopidas showed Epaminondas, he must needs confess that these are more truly and more justly styled colleagues in government and command than the others, Aristides and Themistocles, Cimon and Pericles, Nicias and Alcibiades, who showed more of envy and jealousy than of a noble and free spirit. The liberation of Thebes is the great story of the life. Pelopidas, with Charon and a band of exiles numbering 48, entered Thebes on a snowy winter day and overthrew the Spartan garrison. Plutarch narrates the episode with the precision of a novelist. The near discovery when Archias received the warning letter and said, "Urgent business tomorrow," a phrase that became a proverb among the Greeks. The moment when Charon delivered his son to Pelopidas with the words, "If you find me a traitor, treat the boy as an enemy," without any mercy. And the scene of the conspirators entering the banquet in women's clothing over their breastplates, their faces hidden by garlands of fir and pine. The liberation was followed by the Battle of Leuctra, where Epaminondas broke the Spartan phalanx and Pelopidas led the sacred band to a victory that ended Spartan supremacy in Greece. The death of Pelopidas is Plutarch's illustration of the moral that opens the life. In the battle against Alexander of Phaerae, Pelopidas saw the tyrant in the right wing and, inflamed at the sight and blindly following his passion, regardless alike of his own life and his command, advanced far before his soldiers, crying out and challenging the tyrant. He was killed by javelins thrown from a distance. Plutarch's judgment is implicit but clear. The act was brave but foolish, because Pelopidas was the 13th time commander of the Boeotians, and his death left Thebes without its best general. The Thessalians, who begged the right to bury him, said, "You have lost only a good general, we both a general and our liberty." The Sacred Band. Pelopidas organized the Sacred Band as a unified fighting force of 300 lovers and beloved. The men who fought at Leuctra were, in Philip's words, men who either did or suffered anything that was base. The Snowy Day. The liberation of Thebes. 48 men entering the city in a snowstorm, disguised as countrymen, is Plutarch's portrait of the courage that makes liberty possible. The rashness. Pelopidas advanced alone against Alexander of Phaerae, regardless alike of his own life and his command. The man who had won the greatest victory in Greek history died because he could not control his anger. Quote, "Private men, my wife, should be advised to look to themselves, generals to save others." Quote, "That you may be the sooner ruined, being then more hated by the gods than now." Quote, "You have lost only a good general, we both a general and our liberty. For how shall we dare to desire from you another captain, since we cannot restore Pelopidas?" Marcellus. Marcus Claudius Marcellus is the Roman general who embodied the principle that courage and culture are not opposites but complements, and whose death through his own rashness proved that even the bravest man must sometimes know when not to fight. Plutarch opens by noting that Marcellus was by long experience skillful in the art of war, of a strong body, valiant of hand, and by natural inclinations addicted to war, but also modest and obliging, and so far studious of Greek learning and discipline as to honor and admire those that excelled in it. The man who defeated Hannibal and captured Syracuse was also the man who brought the Marcellus Theater to Rome and who wept at the sight of Greek art being plundered. The defining quality of Marcellus was his personal courage, which Plutarch describes with the admiration of a man who understood the power of the body in the ancient world. In single combat, he surpassed himself. He never declined a challenge and never accepted one without killing his challenger. In Sicily, he saved his brother Ottocilius when surrounded in battle and slew the enemies that pressed upon him. When the Gauls invaded Italy, Marcellus fought at the head of his troops and won a series of victories that earned him the spolia opima, the supreme honor for a Roman general who killed the enemy king in single combat and dedicated his spoils to Jupiter Feretrius. Plutarch records that this was only the third time in Roman history that the spolia opima had been won. The Sicilian campaign is the great military story of the life. Marcellus was the Roman Pericles, the sword to Fabius's buckler, as Posidonius recorded. He defeated Hannibal at Nola through a combination of courage and tactical skill, and he captured Syracuse after a long siege. But the capture was accompanied by a moral catastrophe that Plutarch narrates with the precision of a moralist. When the city fell, Marcellus wept at the sight of the Greek art being plundered, and he spared the temple of Archimedes. But the soldiers spared nothing else. The destruction of Syracuse was a crime that Marcellus could not undo, and Plutarch records that the Syracusans cursed him for it, though he had personally tried to save their city. The death of Marcellus is the final illustration of the life's theme, that the courage which risks a general's life is not the same as the courage that wins a battle. Hannibal set a trap for Marcellus in the hills near Venusia, and Marcellus rode out alone to reconnoiter. When his escort was ambushed and most of his staff killed, Marcellus drew his sword and charged at the enemy, and was killed by javelins thrown from a distance. Plutarch records that Hannibal, when he found the body, admired its beauty and dressed it in his finest robes before sending it back to the Roman camp. The conqueror of Syracuse, the man who had defeated Hannibal at Nola and won the spolia opima against the Gauls, died because he could not control his impulse to fight. The sword and the buckler. Posidonius recorded that the Romans called Marcellus their sword and Fabius their buckler. The vigor of the one mixed with the steadiness of the other made the salvation of Rome. The weeping conqueror. When Syracuse fell, Marcellus wept at the sight of Greek art being plundered. The general who conquered the city was also the man who tried to save it. The death at Venusia. Hannibal set a trap, and Marcellus rode out alone. The man who had defeated Hannibal at Nola died because he could not resist the impulse to reconnoiter in person. Quote, "He was indeed, by long experience, skillful in the art of war, of a strong body, valiant of hand, and by natural inclinations addicted to war. This high temper and heat he showed conspicuously in battle. In other respects he was modest and obliging, and so far studious of Greek learning and discipline as to honor and admire those that excelled in it." Quote, "Marcellus, ignorant or unskillful of no kind of fighting, in single combat surpassed himself. He never declined a challenge, and never accepted without killing his challenger." Quote, "The Romans called Marcellus their sword, and Fabius their buckler, and that the vigor of the one, mixed with the steadiness of the other, made a happy compound that proved the salvation of Rome." The comparison of Pelopidas with Marcellus. Plutarch draws the parallel between Pelopidas and Marcellus with deliberate precision. Both were valiant, diligent, daring, and high-spirited. Both fell through their own rashness, and both served as the instrument of their country's greatest victories. The comparison is framed by the life's opening digression on the proper relationship between valor and the risk of death, and the comparison's conclusion is that both men wasted their lives when their countries most needed them. The contrast in military character is the most striking difference. Marcellus was a man of action who fought in person, killing his enemies in single combat and leading his troops from the front. Pelopidas was the leader of the sacred band, the elite fighting force of 300 lovers and beloved, and his courage was expressed not in personal combat, but in the discipline and morale of the men he commanded. Plutarch notes that Marcellus, in single combat, surpassed himself. He never declined a challenge, and never accepted without killing his challenger, while Pelopidas was never overcome in any battle, where himself was present and commanded in chief. The contrast is between the warrior who fights alone and the commander who inspires others to fight. The contrast in their treatment of the conquered is equally significant. Marcellus, after capturing Syracuse, allowed the soldiers to plunder the city and massacre the inhabitants, though he personally wept at the sight. Plutarch records that Pelopidas and Epaminondas, never after any victory put men to death or reduced citizens to slavery, and that the Thebans would not, had these men been present, have taken the measures they did against the Orchomenians. The distinction is between the conqueror who destroys the conquered and the liberator who respects them, and Plutarch ranks the latter above the former. The deaths of both men are treated with Plutarch's characteristic blend of admiration and criticism. Pelopidas advanced alone against Alexander of Pherae because he could not control his anger, but Plutarch argues that the object of his victory, which consisted in the slaughter of the tyrant, presenting itself to his eyes, did not wholly carry him away unadvisedly. He could not easily expect again to have another equally glorious occasion for the exercise of his courage in a noble and honorable cause. Marcellus, by contrast, rode out alone to reconnoiter, not to kill a tyrant, but to satisfy his curiosity about the enemy's position. He, namely, who had borne 5 consulates, led 3 triumphs, won the spoils and glories of kings and victories, to act the part of a mere scout or sentinel, and to expose all his achievements to be trod underfoot by the mercenary Spaniards and Numidians. The distinction is between the death that is a final act of courage and the death that is a waste of a career. The final point is the manner of their funerals. After Pelopidas's death, his friends, for whom he died, made a funeral for him. The enemies, by whom he had been killed, made one for Marcellus. A noble and happy lot indeed the former. Yet there is something higher and greater in the admiration rendered by enemies to the virtue that had been their own obstacle than in the grateful acknowledgments of friends. Plutarch's judgment is characteristically balanced. Both deaths were tragic, but the enemy's tribute is the greater honor. The sacred band versus single combat. Pelopidas led 300 lovers into battle. Marcellus killed his enemies one by one. The difference between inspiring others and fighting alone. Liberator versus conqueror. Pelopidas never put men to death after a victory. Marcellus allowed Syracuse to be plundered, the distinction between the liberator who respects the conquered and the conqueror who destroys them. The enemy's funeral. Pelopidas was buried by his friends. Marcellus was buried by his enemies. Plutarch argues that the enemy's tribute is the greater honor. Quote, "The suddenness and strangeness of their ends gives me a feeling rather of pain and distress." Quote, "After Pelopidas's death, his friends, for whom he died, made a funeral for him. The enemies, by whom he had been killed, made one for Marcellus. A noble and happy lot indeed the former. Yet there is something higher and greater in the admiration rendered by enemies to the virtue that had been their own obstacle than the grateful acknowledgments of friends. The just and the ambitious." Aristides. Aristides is Plutarch's portrait of the man who earned the most extraordinary nickname in Greek history. The just, and who proved that justice, in a democratic city, is both the most necessary and the most dangerous of virtues. Plutarch opens with a scholarly digression on whether Aristides was rich or poor, since the sources disagree. Some say he passed his life in extreme poverty and left behind him 2 daughters whose indigence long kept them unmarried, while Demetrius of Phalerum argues for his opulence. The disagreement itself is significant. Aristides was a man so famous for his justice that even his bank balance became a matter of moral argument. The defining quality of Aristides was his incorruptibility, which Plutarch illustrates through a series of anecdotes that are characteristically precise. When judging between 2 private persons, one declared that his adversary had injured Aristides. "Tell me rather, good friend," he said, "what wrong he has done you, for it is your cause, not my own, which I now sit judge of." When prosecuting the law against an enemy, and the judges refused to hear the criminal and proceeded immediately to sentence, Aristides rose and petitioned for the man to have a hearing, because justice required it. When appointed to charge of the public revenue, he showed that not only his contemporaries, but the preceding officers had alienated much treasure, especially Themistocles. These episodes are not mere illustrations of character. They are evidence of a fundamental principle, that justice is not a sentiment but a discipline, and that the man who practices it must apply it equally to friends and enemies. The ostracism is the central episode of the life. Themistocles spread the rumor that Aristides was secretly making way for a monarchy in his own person, without the assistance of guards. The Athenians, grown confident after their victories, banished him. The famous story of the illiterate farmer who asked Aristides to write his own name on the shirt, "I'm tired of hearing him everywhere called the just," is Plutarch's way of showing that even justice can become a form of tyranny. At his departure, Aristides prayed that the Athenians might never have any occasion which should constrain them to remember Aristides, a prayer that was answered when Xerxes invaded Greece 3 years later and the banished men were recalled. The return and the Battle of Plataea are the great military episodes. Aristides sailed through the enemy fleet at night to reach Themistocles' tent and proposed that they lay aside their vain and childish contention and compete instead for the preservation of Greece. At Plataea, when the Tagetans claimed precedence for the Athenians based on their ancestors' heroism, Aristides replied, "We are come, not to differ with our friends, but to fight our enemies, not to extol our ancestors, but ourselves to behave as valiant men." And when Pausanias asked the Athenians to take the right wing opposite the Persians, the other captains regarded it as an insult. But Aristides understood that being placed opposite the strongest enemy was an honor, not a degradation. The battle was won, and Aristides' justice was vindicated not in the courts, but on the field. The ostracism. The illiterate farmer who banned Aristides because he was tired of hearing him called the just, Plutarch's portrait of the moment when virtue becomes a public nuisance. The night sail. Aristides sailing through the Persian fleet at night to reach Themistocles, the enemy who became the ally, because justice transcends personal quarrel. The right wing. At Plataea, Aristides accepted the post opposite the strongest enemy as an honor, because justice means taking the hardest duty, not the easiest. Quote, "For not it seeming just, but being so he aims. And from his depth of soil below harvests of wise and prudent counsels grow." Quote, "Tell me rather, good friend, what wrong he has done you, for it is your cause, not my own, which I now sit judge of." Quote, "We are come, not to differ with our friends, but to fight our enemies, not to extol our ancestors, but ourselves to behave as valiant men." Marcus Cato. Marcus Cato is Plutarch's portrait of the Roman ideal made flesh. The man who farmed his own land, drank only water, carried his own arms on foot, and proved that poverty is not an obstacle to greatness, but the foundation of it. Plutarch opens with Cato's origins at Tusculum, in the country of the Sabines, where his father's estate lay. His ancestors seeming almost entirely unknown, Cato himself praised his father Marcus as a worthy man and a brave soldier, and his great-grandfather as one who had often obtained military prizes. The Romans called men like Cato new men or upstarts, men who had no repute by birth but made themselves eminent by their own exertions. Cato accepted the label in public affairs, but insisted that in the exploits and virtues of his ancestors he was very ancient. The defining quality of Cato was his frugality, which Plutarch describes with the admiration of a man who understood the moral power of simplicity. He gained his good habit of body by working with his own hands and living temperately and serving in war. In marches he bore his own arms on foot, while one servant followed to carry his provisions. When he was with the army, he used to drink only water, unless, perhaps, when extremely thirsty, he might mingle it with a little vinegar, or if he found his strength fail him, take a little wine. The model for this life was Manius Curius, the farmer general who had driven Pyrrhus out of Italy and who, after 3 triumphs, was contented to dig in a small piece of ground and live in a cottage, and who told the Samnite ambassadors who offered him gold that he who was content with such a supper had no need of gold, and that it was more honorable to conquer those who possessed the gold than to possess it himself. The political career of Cato was shaped by this frugality and by his relationship with Fabius Maximus. When Cato was treasurer under Scipio the Great, he freely told the young general that his lavish spending was corrupting the frugality of the soldiers. Scipio dismissed him, but Cato's point was made, and it defined his political identity for the rest of his life. As censor, he reduced the luxury of the rich, regulated the behavior of women, and imposed a severity of manners that made him both admired and hated. Plutarch records that he sold the public horses rather than pay the cost of their keep, and that he pulled down houses that encroached on the public way, regardless of the persons who owned them. He would not suffer a ditch to be made on private ground where he saw it would prejudice the public, nor allow any builder to raise it to it of any strength upon his neighbor's foundation. And where he had condemned any delinquent, he would not allow the fine to be redeemed, but required the actual payment. The moral portrait is of a man whose virtues and vices were inseparable. Cato was frugal, hard-working, incorruptible, and also harsh, vindictive, and cruel. Plutarch records that he sold his old slaves rather than maintain them when they could no longer work, and that when his wife Tertia was ill, he had to be persuaded to stay with her rather than going to his farm. The old soldier who could face Hannibal without flinching could not face the suffering of a sick woman. Plutarch's judgment is characteristically balanced. Cato was a determined champion for justice, but his justice was the justice of a man who believed that the state's interests always outweighed the individual's, and that severity was a form of virtue. The man who built the basilica at Utica and read Greek philosophy in his old age was also the man who opposed Scipio, attacked the luxury of the rich, and drove his wife to despair. The farmer general. The visit to Manius Curius's cottage, where Cato saw the man who had driven Pyrrhus out of Italy boiling turnips in the chimney corner, was the defining experience of his life. The censor's severity. As censor, Cato sold the public horses, pulled down private houses that encroached on the public way, and regulated the behavior of women. The moral legislation of a man who believed that frugality was the foundation of the republic. The new man. Cato accepted the label of upstart in public affairs, but insisted that in the virtues of his ancestors he was very ancient. The paradox of a man who proved that birth is less important than character. Quote, he would strike boldly, without flinching, stand firm to his ground, fix a bold countenance upon his enemies, and with a harsh, threatening voice accost them, justly thinking himself and telling others that such a rugged kind of behavior sometimes terrifies the enemy more than the sword itself. Quote, I, who was content with such a supper, had no need of gold, and that I thought it more honorable to conquer those who possess the gold than to possess the gold itself. Quote, he was of a ruddy complexion and gray-eyed, as the writer, who, with no good will, made the following epigram upon him, lets us see. Porcius, who snarls at all in every place, with his gray eyes, and with his fiery face, even after death will scarce admitted be into the infernal realms by Hecate. The comparison of Aristides with Marcus Cato. The comparison of Aristides with Marcus Cato is one of Plutarch's most penetrating exercises in comparative judgment. The two men share the same fundamental quality, virtue and industry as the sole means of advancement. But Plutarch discovers that the context in which they operated made their virtues function very differently. Aristides appeared in Athens when the chief magistrates were men of moderate and equal fortunes, and the richest estates were valued at only 500 medimnes. Cato, by contrast, leaped into a vast ocean of Roman politics at a time when poverty was not advanced from the plow and spade to be governors and magistrates, but greatness of family, riches, and personal application were what the city looked for. It was not as great a matter to have Themistocles for an adversary, Plutarch observes, as to contest with a Scipio Africanus, a Servius Galba, and a Quintius Flamininus, having no other aid but a tongue free to assert right. The military comparison is similarly weighted. Aristides at Marathon and Plataea was but one commander out of 10. Miltiades carried the day at Marathon, Themistocles at Salamis, Pausanias at Plataea. Cato, by contrast, was chosen consul with a single colleague, having many competitors, and was preferred before 7 most noble pretenders to be censor. And while Aristides was never principal in any action, Cato not only in his consulship was esteemed the chief in courage and conduct in the Spanish War, but even whilst he was only serving as tribune at Thermopylae, Under another's command, he gained the glory of the victory, for having, as it were, opened a wide gate for the Romans to rush in upon Antiochus. But the deepest difference is in the sphere of domestic economy. In this, Plutarch argues, Cato was truly great, for he increased his estate and became a master to others in economy and husbandry. Aristides, by his poverty, made justice odious, as if it were the pest and impoverisher of a family, and beneficial to all rather than to those that were endowed with it. Cato's family produced senators and generals to the fourth generation. His grandchildren and their children came to the highest preferments. But Aristides, who was the principal man of Greece, through extreme poverty reduced some of his to get their living by jugglers' tricks, others, for want, to hold out their hands for public alms, leaving none means to perform any noble action or worthy his dignity. Plutarch's final judgment, however, is characteristically balanced. He asks whether poverty is dishonorable in itself, or only when it is a proof of laziness, intemperance, luxury, and carelessness. In a person that is temperate, industrious, just, and valiant, and who uses all his virtues for the public good, poverty shows a great and lofty mind. The comparison ends with a meditation on wealth and contentment. What most of all enables a man to serve the public is not wealth, but content and independence, which, requiring no superfluity at home, distracts not the mind from the common good. Domestic economy. Cato increased his estate and became a master of husbandry. Aristides left his daughters destitute, and Plutarch asks whether poverty that impoverishes the family is a form of injustice. The adversary. It was harder to be Cato than to be Aristides, because Cato had to contest with Scipio Africanus and his allies, while Aristides only had Themistocles. Content and independence. Plutarch's final thesis, that what enables a man to serve the public is not wealth, but content and independence, is the moral of both lives. Quote, "It was not as great a matter to have Themistocles for an adversary, as to contest with a Scipio Africanus, a Servius Galba, and a Quintius Flamininus, having no other aid but a tongue free to assert right." Quote, "What most of all enables a man to serve the public is not wealth, but content and independence, which, requiring no superfluity at home, distracts not the mind from the common good." Philopoemen. Philopoemen is Plutarch's portrait of the last of the Greeks, the man who proved that a great soldier could also be a philosopher, and that the decline of a nation could be halted, if only for a generation, by the force of a single character. Plutarch opens with the education of Philopoemen by Cleandur, an exile from Mantinia, who repaid his friend Crogys' hospitable kindness in the care of the orphan son. After childhood, the principal tuition passed to Ecdemus and Demophanes, megalopolitans who had been scholars in the academic philosophy and friends to Arcesilaus, and who had freed their country from tyranny by the death of Aristodemus. They thought they had done a general good to Greece by giving Philopoemen the nurture of philosophy, and Plutarch agrees. All Greece, which looked upon him as a kind of latter birth brought forth, after so many noble leaders, in her decrepit age, loved him wonderfully. The military reforms of Philopoemen were the turning point of the Achaean League. Before him, the Achaeans had used light bucklers and short javelins, skillful in skirmishing, but at a disadvantage in close fight. Philopoemen persuaded them to change the narrow target and short javelin into a large shield and long pike, to arm their heads, bodies, thighs, and legs, and instead of loose skirmishing, to fight firmly and foot to foot. But the deeper reform was cultural. He turned idle profusion and luxury into honorable expense, so that nothing was to be seen in the shops but plate breaking up or melting down, gilding of breastplate, and studding bucklers and bits with silver. The women dyed helmets and crests, embroidered military cloaks and riding frocks. The whole city became an arsenal of virtue. The Battle of Mantinia against Mechanidas is Plutarch's great military set piece. When the tyrant's mercenaries beat the front line and Mechanidas hotly followed the chase, passing beyond the Achaean phalanx, Philopoemen, professing to make it a matter of small consequence, waited until the enemy were at a great distance, then charged suddenly and overthrew the Lacedaemonians with great slaughter. The pursuit of Mechanidas himself became a personal combat. It looked less like the contest between two generals than like the last defense of some wild beast brought to bay by the keen huntsman Philopoemen and forced to fight for his life. The tyrant's horse leapt the ditch, but Philopoemen ran him through with his spear as he struggled to raise himself on the other side. The death of Philopoemen is Plutarch's most moving scene. Taken prisoner by the Messenians, he was carried through the city in chains, and when the Messenians asked him whether he had come to set Messene free, he answered that he had come, if it were possible. On hearing he was to be tried and executed, he took poison he had long carried about him, the same poison that had been prepared for the philosopher Philaucus. The Messenians, learning this, were amazed that a man who had never feared death in the field had taken such pains to avoid it. Plutarch's answer is that Philopoemen feared not death, but disgrace, death at the hands of private enemies, which would destroy the reputation he had built over a lifetime. The last of the Greeks, a Roman called Philopoemen, the last of the Greeks, as if after him Greece had produced no great man, nor who deserved the name of Greek. The Mantinea chase, the image of Philopoemen pursuing Mechanidas like a huntsman bringing a wild beast to bay, Plutarch's portrait of military virtue at its most physical. The poison, Philopoemen carrying poison about him as a philosopher's provision against disgrace. Plutarch's portrait of the man who feared not death, but the indignity of an enemy's tribunal. Quote, under his conduct Greece was glorious and was free. Quote, it looked less like the contest between two generals than like the last defense of some wild beast brought to bay by the keen huntsman Philopoemen and forced to fight for his life. Quote, all Greece, which looked upon him as a kind of latter birth brought forth, after so many noble leaders, in her decrepit age, loved him wonderfully. Flamininus. Titus Quinctius Flamininus is Plutarch's portrait of the Roman who conquered Greece not by force but by charm, and who proved that the liberator and the tyrant can be the same man, depending on who tells the story. Plutarch opens with Flamininus's temperament. His mind was warm both in anger and kindness, but in punishing he was ever moderate, never inflexible. But whatever courtesy or good turn he set about, he went through with it, and was as perpetually kind and obliging to those on whom he had poured his favors, as if they, not he, had been the benefactors. But he was ever thirsty after honor, and passionate for glory. And if anything of a greater and more extraordinary nature were to be done, he was eager to be the doer of it himself. The military narrative is of Flamininus against Philip of Macedon. The Romans had not previously held much correspondence with Greece, and Greece would not so soon have embraced a foreign authority had not the general been of a kind, gentle nature, one who worked rather by fair means than force. Flamininus forced his way over the mountains against Philip's army at the pass of the Opsus, and at Cynocephaly he won the decisive battle, though Plutarch notes that the victory was won partly by the valor of the soldiers and partly by the good fortune of the Romans. After the battle, Flamininus behaved with characteristic magnanimity. He received Philip's ambassadors kindly, and made a peace that left the Macedonian kingdom intact, but stripped it of its Greek conquests. The great scene is the proclamation at the Isthmian Games. Flamininus had assembled the Greeks at Corinth, and at the games, when the trumpets sounded for silence, a herald announced that the Roman Senate and Titus Quinctius Flamininus, proconsul, declared the freedom of the Greeks, that they should live according to their own laws, that garrisons should be withdrawn from all cities, and that all exiles should be restored. The joy of the Greeks was so great that they burst into tears, and in the excitement several men were trampled to death in the rush to reach the proclaimer. It was, as Plutarch records, a moment of genuine liberation, and Flamininus knew it, for he had arranged it to coincide with the games when all Greece was assembled. But the deeper judgment is more complex. Flamininus, Plutarch suggests, was motivated not by love of Greece, but by love of glory, and he was willing to sacrifice Greek interests to Roman ones when it suited him. He allowed Nabis, the tyrant of Sparta, to keep his power in exchange for his alliance, and when the Achaeans complained, he dismissed them with a speech that was, as Plutarch says, a very sharp and severe rebuke. The liberator of Greece had become its judge, and the judgment was that Greece should be grateful for whatever Rome chose to give it. The proclamation. The moment at the Isthmian Games when the herald announced the freedom of the Greeks, and the crowd wept with joy, was Plutarch's portrait of the power of words over armies. The magnanimous victor, Flamininus, received Philip's ambassadors after Cynocephaly with courtesy and made a peace that left the Macedonian kingdom intact. The magnanimity of a man who knew that generosity is the highest form of power. The sharp rebuke. When the Achaeans complained that Flamininus had allowed Nabis to keep his tyranny, he rebuked them sharply, the liberator reminding his freed subjects who was really in charge. Quote, "Whatever courtesy or good turn he set about, he went through with it, and was as perpetually kind and obliging to those on whom he had poured his favors, as if they, not he, had been the benefactors." Quote, "The general of these strangers had been of a kind, gentle nature, one who worked rather by fair means than force, of a persuasive address in all applications to others, and no less courteous and open to all addresses of others to him, and above all bent and determined on justice." The comparison of Philopoemen with Flamininus. The comparison of Philopoemen with Flamininus is one of Plutarch's most subtle exercises in comparative judgment, a comparison between the Greek and the Roman, between the soldier and the diplomat, between the man who fought for his country and the man who freed a foreign one. The comparison opens with a generous acknowledgement of Flamininus's achievement. They were Greeks fighting against Greeks, but Titus, a stranger to Greece, fought for her. At the very time when Philopoemen went over to Crete, destitute of means to succor his besieged countrymen, Titus, by a defeat given to Philip in the heart of Greece, set them and their cities free. The liberator's benefit was immediate and concrete. Philopoemen's was long-term and structural. But Plutarch turns the comparison against Flamininus in the sphere of military skill. Philopoemen, whilst he was the Achaeans' general, slew more Greeks than Titus. In aiding the Greeks, slew Macedonians. A fact that sounds damning until Plutarch adds that Philopoemen was always opposed to his countrymen, and that this misfortune was itself a proof of his merit. The many battles he fought and the many trophies he won may make us ascribe to Philopoemen the more thorough knowledge of war. Titus decided the matter betwixt Philip and himself in 2 engagements. But Philopoemen came off victorious in 10,000 encounters, to all which fortune had scarcely any pretense, so much were they owing to his skill. The deeper contrast is between the conditions under which they operated. Titus got his renown, assisted by the power of a flourishing Rome. Philopoemen flourished under a declined Greece, so that his successes may be accounted his own. In Titus's glory, Rome claims a share. The one had brave men under him. The other made as brave by being over them. And though Philopoemen introduced a discipline and tactics of his own, and new-molded and modeled his soldiers, while Titus had his victories made for him by the Roman military machine, Plutarch grants that Titus acquitted himself admirably both as a governor and as an ambassador, while Philopoemen was no less serviceable in the capacity of a private man than in that of a commander. The final judgment is characteristically balanced, since it does not appear to be easy, by any review or discussion, to establish the true difference of their merits and decide to which a preference is due. Will it be an unfair award in the case, if we let the Greek bear away the crown for military conduct and warlike skill, and the Roman for justice and clemency? Plutarch divides the honors equally, the Greek for the art of war, the Roman for the art of governance, and in doing so acknowledges that the comparison is not between 2 men, but between 2 civilizations. The liberator and the soldier. Flamininus freed Greece from Philip's domination. Philopoemen defended it against its own weakness. The liberator acts from outside. The defender acts from within. Flourishing under decline. Philopoemen's successes are his own because he operated under a declined Greece. Titus's glory is shared with Rome. The comparison is between a man who created his own army and a man who inherited one. The crown divided. Plutarch's final judgment. The Greek bears the crown for military conduct. the Roman for justice and clemency, is the moral of both lives. Quote, the one had brave men under him, the other made as brave by being over them. Quote, since it does not appear to be easy, by any review or discussion, to establish the true difference of their merits and decide to which a preference is due, will it be an unfair award in the case, if we let the Greek bear away the crown for military conduct and warlike skill, and the Roman for justice and clemency? Fortune's favorites and victims. Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus is Plutarch's portrait of the warrior king whose career embodied the paradox of military genius without political wisdom, the man who won every battle but lost every war. Plutarch opens with Pyrrhus's ancestry, tracing him through Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, to the Molossian kings of Epirus, and with the miraculous escape of the infant Pyrrhus from his enemies. When the pursuers overtook the party carrying the child, they delivered the infant to faithful young fellows who made for Megara in Macedon. Reaching the river in darkness, they wrote on a piece of bark the necessities of the child, threw it across, and were rescued by men who cut down trees and lashed them together. He who first got ashore and took Pyrrhus in his arms was named Achilles, Plutarch's way of connecting the child to his legendary ancestor. The defining scene of the life is the conversation between Pyrrhus and his advisor Cineas. When Cineas asked what they would do after conquering Italy, Pyrrhus answered Sicily. After Sicily, Libya and Carthage. After Carthage, Macedon and Greece. And when all were conquered, we will live at our ease, my dear friend, and drink all day, and divert ourselves with pleasant conversation. Cineas replied, and what hinders us now, sir, if we have a mind to be merry and entertain one another, since we have at hand without trouble all those necessary things, to which through much blood and great labor, and infinite hazards and mischief done to ourselves and to others, we design at last to arrive? This is Plutarch's portrait of the fundamental irrationality of ambition, the man who pursues conquest for the sake of leisure, when leisure is already available. The Italian campaigns are the great military episodes. At Heraclea, Pyrrhus saw the Roman order and said, this order, Megacles, of the barbarians, is not at all barbarian in character. We shall see presently what they can do. After the battle, won at heavy cost by the use of elephants, the famous exchange with the Roman ambassador Fabricius gave the world the phrase Pyrrhic victory. The ambassador refused Pyrrhus's offer of a share in the kingdom, and Pyrrhus, after freeing the Roman prisoners without ransom, sailed back to Epirus. But the deeper lesson is Pyrrhus's inability to learn from his victories. Each battle won left him weaker. Each peace broken left him more isolated. The Cineas dialogue, the great philosophical scene. Pyrrhus's confession that all his conquests are aimed at living at ease and drinking all day, and Cineas's demonstration that this end could be reached immediately without bloodshed. The infant on the bark, the miraculous escape from the river. Pyrrhus's life began with a message thrown across the water, and Plutarch's way of saying that this king was born under the sign of survival. The Pyrrhic victory, the battle at Heraclea where Pyrrhus won, but lost so many men that he could not follow up his advantage. Plutarch's portrait of a victory that is worse than defeat. Quote, we will live at our ease, my dear friend, and drink all day, and divert ourselves with pleasant conversation. Quote, and what hinders us now, sir, if we have a mind to be merry and entertain one another, since we have at hand without trouble all those necessary things, to which through much blood and great labor, and infinite hazards and mischief done to ourselves and to others, we design at last to arrive? Quote, this order, Megacles, of the barbarians, is not at all barbarian in character. We shall see presently what they can do. Caius Marius. Caius Marius is Plutarch's portrait of the self-made man, whose virtues and vices were inseparable. The soldier who rose from nothing to become 7 times consul, and whose old age was consumed by the cruelty and vindictiveness that his early career had merely concealed. Plutarch opens with the famous remark about Marius's ignorance of Greek. He is said never to have either studied Greek or to have use of that language in any matter of consequence. thinking it ridiculous to bestow time in that learning, the teachers of which were little better than slaves. When Greek shows were presented at the dedication of a temple, Marius only sat down and immediately departed. Plutarch observes that if any could have persuaded Marius to pay his devotions to the Greek muses and graces, he had never brought his incomparable actions to so unworthy a conclusion, or wrecked himself, so to say, upon an old age of cruelty and vindictiveness, through passion, ill-timed ambition, and insatiable cupidity. The early career is a catalogue of persistence against disadvantage. Marius was born of parents altogether obscure and indigent, who supported themselves by daily labor. He first served as a soldier against the Celtiberians, where Scipio Africanus, gently clapping Marius on the shoulder as he sat next him, replied, "Here, perhaps," when asked where the Romans should obtain another great general after himself. As tribune, Marius threatened the consulcata and ordered the arrest of Metellus, his own patron, when Metellus rose to oppose him. The Senate complied, and Marius came forth with glory. But he immediately lost the people's favor by opposing a law for the distribution of corn, making himself equally honored by both parties and gratifying neither. The military career that followed, the defeat of Jugurtha, the victories over the Teutons and the Cimbri, is what made Marius's name immortal. But Plutarch's portrait focuses not on the battles, but on the character. Marius endured a surgical operation on his legs without flinching, endured the drudgery of the camp without complaint, endured every hardship with a body that was like a piece of iron. But he could not endure the success of others, and his old age was consumed by paranoia, cruelty, and the bloody proscriptions that made Rome a city of terror. The man who had saved Rome from the barbarians destroyed it from within. The shoulder tap, Scipio's prophecy, here perhaps, when asked where the Romans should find another great general. Plutarch's way of saying that greatness can be detected in its earliest stages. The arrest of Metellus, Marius ordering the arrest of his own patron when Metellus rose to oppose him. The moment when ambition overrode gratitude. The old age, Plutarch's devastating judgment. Marius wrecked himself, so to say, upon an old age of cruelty and vindictiveness, through passion, ill-timed ambition, and insatiable cupidity. Quote, "If any could have persuaded Marius to pay his devotions to the Greek muses and graces, he had never brought his incomparable actions, both in war and peace, to so unworthy a conclusion, or wrecked himself, so to say, upon an old age of cruelty and vindictiveness, through passion, ill-timed ambition, and insatiable cupidity." Quote, here perhaps, Lysander. Lysander is Plutarch's portrait of the Spartan who destroyed Athens and, in doing so, destroyed Sparta's own moral foundation. The paradox of Lysander's character is stated at the outset. He endured poverty very well, was not at all enslaved or corrupted by wealth, and yet filled his country with riches and the love of them, taking away from them the glory of not admiring money. When Dionysius the tyrant sent his daughters costly gowns, Lysander refused them, saying he was afraid they would make them look more unhandsome. But a while after, being sent ambassador to the same tyrant, when he was offered a choice of 2 robes, he took both of them and went his way. The inconsistency is deliberate. Plutarch is showing us a man whose character was shaped not by principle but by ambition, and whose ambition would eventually reshape Sparta itself. The military genius of Lysander is illustrated by the strategy at Aegos Potami, one of the most famous deceptions in ancient warfare. For 4 days, Lysander kept his ships drawn up and manned before daybreak, and when the Athenians sailed out to challenge him, he refused to stir. The Athenians grew extremely confident and disdained their enemies as if they had been afraid and daunted. Alcibiades, who was in his castle in the Chersonese, came on horseback and found fault with their captains for pitching their camp on an exposed beach, but they would not listen. On the 5th day, when the Athenians had sailed out and gone back as usual, Lysander sent some ships as if to spy, then commanded them to row back with all their speed when the Athenians landed, and to lift up a brazen shield as the sign of battle. The result was the destruction of the Athenian fleet in a single hour. Lysander took 3,000 prisoners, and having accomplished a great work with small pains, finished in 1 hour a war which had been protracted to a degree exceeding belief. The destruction of Athens is the most famous episode. When the Athenians yielded up everything, Lysander sent for flute women out of the city, and collected together all that were in the camp, and pulled down the walls, and burnt the ships to the sound of the flute, the allies being crowned with garlands, and making merry together, as counting that day the beginning of their liberty. But the deeper corruption was in what followed. Lysander placed 30 rulers in the city, the 30 tyrants, and put a garrison into the Acropolis. When Polybius, the Spartan governor, struck Autolycus the athlete, Lysander told him he did not know how to govern freemen. But the 30, to gain Polybius's favor, killed Autolycus. The liberator had become the tyrant's patron. The corruption of Sparta through money is Plutarch's central moral argument. The wisest of the Spartans, dreading the influence of money, declared that all the silver and gold should be sent away as alien mischiefs. They resolved to use only iron coin, dipped in vinegar when red hot, that it might not be worked up anew. But Plutarch sees through the legislation. Moral habits induced by public practices are far quicker in making their way into men's private lives than the faults of individuals are in infecting the city at large. Terror and the law were now to keep guard over the citizens' houses, to prevent any money entering into them. But their minds could no longer be expected to remain superior to the desire of it when wealth was thus set up to be striven after as a high and noble object. The man who had introduced gold and silver into Greece, though keeping not one drachma for himself, had corrupted Sparta more thoroughly than any enemy could have done. The ambition to become king was the final revelation of Lysander's character. Plutarch records that Lysander conceived the project of altering the law so that the crown might be given not only to the Heraclidi, but to any eminent man of the Heraclidi. In other words, to himself. He had arranged for a prophet to come from Delphi with an oracle to that effect, and the matter was nearly decided when a soldier, who was his enemy, discovered the deception and proved that the prophet had been bribed. Lysander died shortly after in a battle in Boeotia, and the oracle and the plot died with him. Plutarch's judgment is that the ambition was not for power, but for glory, and that glory, in the end, is the most dangerous of all passions. The two robes. When offered a choice of two robes by Dionysius, Lysander took both. Plutarch's way of showing that the man who refused the gowns for his daughters had no scruple about enriching himself. Egos podami, 4 days of refusal to fight, then a brazen shield lifted from a ship's foredeck, and the Athenian fleet destroyed in a single hour. Plutarch's portrait of patience as a military weapon. The walls come down. The walls of Athens pulled down to the sound of flute music, the allies crowned with garlands. Plutarch's portrait of victory as a kind of ritual destruction. Alien mischiefs. The wisest Spartans calling gold and silver alien mischiefs, and Plutarch's devastating observation that the legislation against private wealth only made public wealth more desirable. Quote, he endured poverty very well, and that he was not at all enslaved or corrupted by wealth, and yet he filled his country with riches and the love of them, and took away from them the glory of not admiring money. Quote, he pulled down the walls and burnt the ships to the sound of the flute, the allies being crowned with garlands, and making merry together, as counting that day the beginning of their liberty. Quote, moral habits induced by public practices are far quicker in making their way into men's private lives than the failings and faults of individuals are in infecting the city at large. Sylla. Lucius Cornelius Sylla is Plutarch's portrait of the man who made civil war a Roman institution, the aristocrat who rose from hired lodgings to become the master of the world, and who proved that the Republic's greatest enemy could also be its greatest servant. Plutarch opens with the famous anecdote of Sylla's early poverty. In his younger days, he lived in hired lodgings at a low rate, and when he was boasting of his exploits in Libya, a person of noble station answered, "And how can you be an honest man, who, since the death of a father who left you nothing, have become so rich. A freedman who had lived under the same roof recalled that he paid 2,000 sesterces for the upper rooms and Sylla 3,000 for the lower. The difference between their fortunes was no more than 1,000 sesterces. The story is Plutarch's way of saying that Sylla's genius was not military but social. He knew how to use people, and he never forgot what it was like to be poor. The personal appearance of Sylla is described with Plutarch's characteristic precision. His blue eyes, of themselves extremely keen and glaring, were rendered all the more forbidding by the complexion of his face, in which white was mixed with rough blotches of fiery red. Hence his surname, and the jest of the Athenian jester. Sylla is a mulberry sprinkled o'er with meal. But it was not only his face that was remarkable. Sylla was by nature so addicted to raillery that in his youthful obscure years he would converse freely with players and professed jesters, and join them in all their low pleasures. When supreme master of all, he was often wont to muster together the most impudent players and stage followers of the town, and to drink and bandy jests with them without regard to his age or the dignity of his place. Plutarch sees this not as mere vulgarity, but as a characterological symptom. The man who could not be serious at table was the same man who could order the death of thousands with a stroke of his pen. The rivalry with Marius is the tragic engine of a life. When Sylla was chosen quaestor to Marius in his first consulship, he gained the glory of capturing Jugurtha through the treachery of Bacchus, and Marius was furious. The truth is, Sylla was by nature vainglorious, and his appetite for distinction carried him to such a pitch of ostentation that he had a representation of the action engraved on his signet ring, which he carried about with him ever after, Bacchus delivering, and Sylla receiving, Jugurtha. Plutarch records that so slight and childish were the first occasions and motives of that enmity between them, which, passing afterwards through a long course of civil bloodshed and incurable divisions to find its end in tyranny, and the confusion of the whole state, proved Euripides to have been truly wise when he forewarned all men to beware of ambition, as of all the higher powers the most destructive and pernicious to her votaries. The character of Sylla in power is Plutarch's most devastating portrait. He was the first Roman who marched with an army against the city, and the first who sold the lives of citizens at the rate of 2 talents each. His proscriptions were conducted with a terrible efficiency. Heads were brought to him at table, and he never flinched. Yet he also restored the republic, resigned the dictatorship, and lived in retirement until his death. Plutarch records that Sylla, when dying, ordered that no one should be troubled for anything he had done in his life, and that his friends should erect a monument to him with this inscription: "No friend ever served him, and no enemy ever wronged him, whom he did not reward or the other punish." The epitaph is either supreme irony or supreme self-knowledge, and Plutarch leaves the reader to decide which. The mulberry, the Athenian jester's verse. Sylla is a mulberry sprinkled o'er with meal. Plutarch's portrait of the man whose appearance matched his character, beautiful and repellent, seductive and dangerous. The signet ring, Sylla's ring showing Bacchus delivering Jugurtha, the image that defined his career because it showed that Sylla's genius was not for fighting but for taking credit. The epitaph, "No friend ever served him, and no enemy ever wronged him, whom he did not reward or the other punish." The supreme statement of a man who understood that power is transactional and that the only loyalty is the loyalty of the grateful. Quote, "And how can you be an honest man, who, since the death of a father who left you nothing, have become so rich?" Quote, "So slight and childish were the first occasions and motives of that enmity between them, which, passing afterwards through a long course of civil bloodshed and incurable divisions to find its end in tyranny, and the confusion of the whole state, prove Euripides to have been truly wise when he forewarned all men to beware of ambition, as of all the higher powers the most destructive and pernicious to her votaries." Quote, "No friend ever served him, and no enemy ever wronged him, whom he did not reward or the other punish." The comparison of Lysander with Sylla. The comparison of Lysander with Sylla is one of Plutarch's most searching exercises in comparative judgment, a comparison between two men who both destroyed democracies and replaced them with tyranny, but who did so from opposite directions and with opposite temperaments. The fundamental difference is stated at the outset. Lysander had the consent of his fellow citizens, in times of sober judgment, for the honors he received, nor did he force anything from them against their good will, nor hold any power contrary to the laws. Sylla, by contrast, kept his command for 10 years together, creating himself sometimes consul, sometimes proconsul, and sometimes dictator, but always remaining a tyrant. The distinction is between the man who corrupted a healthy state from within and the man who seized a diseased state from without. Plutarch's analysis of the two men's relationship to wealth and pleasure reveals the deeper contrast between their characters. Lysander did nothing that was intemperate or licentious, in that full command of means and opportunity, but kept clear of the trite saying, "Lions at home, but foxes out of doors," and ever maintained a sober, truly Spartan, and well-disciplined course of conduct. Sylla could never moderate his unruly affections, either by poverty when young or by years when grown old, but would be still prescribing laws to the citizens concerning chastity and sobriety, himself living all that time in lewdness and adultery. Yet both exerted a strange influence on their respective cities. Sylla, a profuse debauchee, endeavored to restore sober living amongst the citizens. Lysander tempered himself, filled Sparta with a luxury he disregarded. Both were blameworthy, the one for raising himself above his own laws, the other for causing his fellow citizens to fall beneath his own example. The military comparison is more complex. Lysander came off twice victorious in 2 battles by sea, and Plutarch adds the siege of Athens, a work of greater fame than difficulty. His death at Haliartus, however, was inglorious. He died not as Cyrus or Epaminondas, sustaining the declining battle or making sure the victory, but as some common skirmisher or scout, cast away his life ingloriously, giving testimony to the wisdom of the ancient Spartan maxim to avoid attacks on walled cities. Sylla, by contrast, took Rome itself twice, as also the Athenian Piraeus, not by famine as Lysander did, but by a series of great battles, driving Archelaus into the sea. The difference is that Lysander fought against opponents who were sharp only at the inglorious point of tongue. Alcibiades as Pilate, the Athenian demagogue, while Sylla contended against Marius, Mithridates, Lamponius, and Telesinus. But Plutarch's deepest insight is about the conditions under which each operated. Lysander had the assistance of the state in all his achievements, whereas Sylla, besides that he was a banished person and overpowered by a fiction, at a time when his wife was driven from home, his houses demolished, adherents slain, himself then in Boeotia, stood embattled against countless numbers of the public enemy. And not even when Mithridates came with proposals of alliance and aid against his enemies would he show any sort of compliance or even clemency, did not so much as address him or vouchsafe him his hand, until he had it from the king's own mouth that he was willing to quit Asia, surrender the navy, and restore Bithynia and Cappadocia. Plutarch calls this the bravest action Sylla ever performed, preferring the public good to the private, and like good hounds, where he had once fixed, never letting go his hold. The final judgment is characteristically balanced. Lysander was the more moderate man in his private life, but the more destructive in his public impact, for he corrupted Sparta more thoroughly than any enemy could have done by introducing gold and silver into a city that had lived without them. Sylla was the more extravagant and cruel in his private life, but the more effective in his public achievements, for he defeated enemies who were more formidable than anything Lysander ever faced, and he restored the Republic after he had destroyed it. Plutarch's conclusion is that both men were dangerous. Lysander because he was virtuous enough to corrupt, Sylla because he was powerful enough to destroy, and that the comparison is not between good and evil, but between two different forms of the same catastrophe. The consent of fellow citizens. Lysander received his honors in times of sober judgment. Sylla seized power when the state was distempered. The distinction is between corruption from within and conquest from without. The strange influence. Both men exerted the opposite of their own character on their cities. The temperate Lysander filled Sparta with luxury. The debauched Scylla restored sobriety. Plutarch's way of saying that virtue and vice are not as simple as they appear. The Good Hound, Scylla's refusal to address Mithridates until the king yielded. Plutarch's portrait of the man who could be noble when the public interest demanded it, even if his private life was depraved. Quote, Scylla, a profuse debauchee, endeavored to restore sober living amongst the citizens. Lysander, tempered himself, filled Sparta with the luxury he disregarded. So that both were blameworthy, the one for raising himself above his own laws, the other for causing his fellow citizens to fall beneath his own example. Quote, he died not as Cyrus or Epaminondas, sustaining the declining battle or making sure the victory. All these died the death of kings and generals. But he, as it had been some common skirmisher or scout, cast away his life ingloriously. Quote, like good hounds, where he had once fixed, never letting go his hold, till the enemy yielded then, and not until then, he set himself to revenge his own private wrongs. Cimon. Cimon is Plutarch's portrait of the aristocratic warrior Philhellene, the man who liberated the Aegean from Persian domination, who opened the Acropolis to the people, and who proved that generosity and military genius are not incompatible with moral blindness. The opening of the life is one of Plutarch's most curious digressions, a story about Damon, an orphan from Caria who was pursued by a Roman captain, conspired to murder him with 16 companions whose faces were daubed with soot, and whose descendants were called Aspelomini, men daubed with soot. The story seems to have nothing to do with Cimon, but Plutarch includes it because it is connected to Lucullus, to whom he compares Cimon. Lucullus happened to be passing that way, inquired into the matter, found the city was in no wise faulty, and carried the soldiers away. The connection is Plutarch's way of saying that his parallel between Cimon and Lucullus is grounded not only in their virtues, but in the personal obligations that link the historian to his subjects. The character of Cimon is described with Plutarch's characteristic precision. He was the son of Miltiades and Hegesippyle, a Thracian princess, and was left an orphan very young when his father was cast into prison for an unpaid fine and died. At first he had but an indifferent reputation, being looked upon as disorderly in his habits, fond of drinking, and resembling his grandfather Cimon, whose simplicity got him the surname of Coalamus, simpleton. Stesimbrotus of Thasos reports that he had little acquaintance with music or any of the liberal studies, that he had nothing of the quickness and ready speech of his countrymen in Attica, and that in his character he resembled rather a native of Peloponnesus than of Athens. Yet this unpolished man became the liberator of the Aegean. He defeated the Persians at the Eurymedon, driving their fleet to shore and then charging their camp while the soldiers were still celebrating their naval victory. A double victory, won in a single day, that Plutarch calls one of the most remarkable in Greek history. The generosity of Cimon is the quality that defines his public life. He opened his estate to all who wished, and Plutarch records that he maintained a common table where any citizen could come and dine. When the Lacedaemonians were building the walls of the Acropolis after the Persian Wars, they asked Athens to send them a craftsman skilled in architecture. Cimon was chosen, and he was the one who first erected those walls in a close and compact style, with large stones fitted together without mortar. But his greatest generosity was political. He persuaded the Athenians to abandon their claim to the islands and revenues of the Delian League and to allow the allied cities to govern themselves, a policy that Plutarch records with admiration but also with reservations, since it was this very generosity that eventually allowed Athens to dominate the allies by naval power rather than by formal alliance. The moral portrait is a man whose virtues and vices were inseparable. Cimon was generous, courageous, and patriotic, and also guilty of an incestuous relationship with his sister Elpinus. Plutarch records the story without comment, but the juxtaposition is deliberate. The man who liberated the Aegean and opened the Acropolis to the people was also the man who transgressed the most fundamental of Greek taboos. The comparison with Lucullus is the organizing principle. Both were valiant in war. Both were gentle in political life. Both were generous to excess, and both failed to complete the enterprises they undertook. They brought their enemies near their ruin, but never entirely conquered them. The Eurymedon, the double victory, at sea and on land, in a single day, was Simon's masterpiece. Plutarch's portrait of the moment when aristocratic courage and military genius were perfectly aligned. The common table, Simon's estate, open to all who wished, was Plutarch's portrait of aristocratic generosity, the opposite of the Spartan meanness that Lycurgus had institutionalized. The walls of the Acropolis. Cimon was the craftsman who first built the walls in a close and compact style. Plutarch's way of saying that the man who liberated Greece was also the man who built it. Quote, rude and unrefined, for great things well endued. Quote, they accused him, in his younger years, of cohabiting with his own sister Elpinus. Lucullus. Lucullus is Plutarch's portrait of the Roman aristocrat who conquered the East, feasted on silver couches, and proved that the greatest luxury is not wealth but leisure. The man whose name became synonymous with a banquet, and whose philosophy Plutarch treats as both genuine and slightly absurd. The opening of the life establishes Lucullus's credentials through his lineage. His grandfather had been consul, his uncle by the mother's side was Metellus Numidicus, and even without these connections, the young Lucullus distinguished himself by accusing the augur Servilius, who had prosecuted his father, an act of filial piety that the Romans commended as an act of high merit, comparing the young man to a good dog attacking wild beasts. The early career under Sylla, the procurement of shipping in Libya and Egypt, the settlement of Cyrene, the refusal of Ptolemy's gifts, established Lucullus as a man of both courage and integrity. The military campaigns against Mithridates are the great set pieces. When Mithridates was besieged by Fimbria on the land and needed to escape by sea, Fimbria begged Lucullus to assist with his navy, but Lucullus refused, whether from loyalty to Sylla or from detestation of Fimbria, who had advanced himself by the death of his friend and general. The refusal allowed Mithridates to escape, and Plutarch records it as either supreme loyalty or supreme folly. The campaigns that followed, the battles at Tenedos, the siege of Cyzicum, the naval victories off the coast of Asia, showed Lucullus's genius for combined operations. Plutarch describes his characteristic method, appearing to retreat, then turning on his pursuers with devastating force, using the enemy's confidence against them, and maintaining discipline in the face of mutiny and desertion. The contrast between Lucullus, the general, and Lucullus, the retired philosopher, is the central irony of the life. When he withdrew from public life and devoted himself to pleasure, he built the famous villas at Tusculum and Neapolis, where he entertained on such a scale that Cicero asked him whether he was dining alone or with the Senate. But Plutarch's portrait is more complex than the caricature suggests. Lucullus's love of learning was genuine, and his devotion to philosophy was not merely a pose. He gave his mind, as it were, its liberty to enjoy in full leisure the refreshment of philosophy, and summoning up his contemplative faculties, administered a timely check to his feelings of emulation and ambition. The man who feasted on silver couches also read Greek poetry and discussed philosophy with Athenodorus. The moral portrait is of a man whose virtues and vices were inseparable. Lucullus was generous, learned, brave, and also careless of consequences, loyal to a fault, and incapable of finishing what he started. Plutarch records that when Pompey was given the command of the war against Mithridates, the war that Lucullus had begun, Lucullus bore it with what Plutarch calls a philosophical resignation, but which might equally be called defeat. The comparison with Cimon is the organizing principle. Both were valiant in war. Both were gentle in political life. Both failed to complete the enterprises they undertook, and both retired from public life into a world of luxury and learning that their earlier selves would scarcely have recognized. The silver couches, Lucullus's famous banquets, Cicero's question about whether he was dining alone or with the Senate, Plutarch's portrait of the man who turned retirement into an art form. The refusal of Fimbria, Lucullus's refusal to help Fimbria capture Mithridates, either supreme loyalty to Scylla or supreme folly for the state. Plutarch's portrait of the man who put friendship above public advantage. The philosophy, Lucullus's genuine love of learning, his Greek history of the Marsian War, his devotion to Athenodorus. Plutarch's portrait of the Roman who proved that a general could also be a scholar. Quote, "It was for a man of no business and much curiosity to see such things, not for him who had left his commander in the field lodging under the ramparts of his enemies." Quote, "He gave his mind, as it were, its liberty, to enjoy in full leisure the refreshment of philosophy, and summoning up his contemplative faculties, administered a timely check to his feelings of emulation and ambition." The comparison of Lucullus with Cimon. The comparison of Lucullus with Cimon is Plutarch's meditation on the proper end of a military life, and on the danger of confusing retirement with redemption. The opening is characteristically generous. One might bless the end of Lucullus, which was so timed as to let him die before the Great Revolution, which fate, by intestine wars, was already effecting against the established government. Cimon also died when Greece was as yet undisordered in its highest felicity, though in the field at the head of his army, not recalled, nor out of his mind, nor sullying the glory of his wars, engagements, and conquests by making feastings and debauches seem the apparent end and aim of them all. Plutarch quotes Plato's scornful remark about Orpheus, who makes an eternal debauch hereafter the reward of those who lived well here, and applies it to Lucullus's retirement. The contrast in their use of wealth is the comparison's most memorable passage. There is no comparison between the south wall of the Acropolis built by Cimon and the chambers and galleries with their sea views built at Naples by Lucullus out of the spoils of the barbarians. Cimon's popular and liberal table received a great many guests every day at small cost. Lucullus's sumptuous oriental one was expensively spread for a few men of pleasure. But Plutarch asks whether different times made the alteration, whether Cimon, if he had retired in his old age from business and war to quiet and solitude, might have lived a more luxurious and self-indulgent life, as he was fond of wine and company, and accused of laxity with women. The better pleasures gained in successful action and effort leave the baser appetites no time or place, and make active and heroic men forget them. The military comparison is more complex. Lucullus outwent Cimon in war, being the first Roman who carried an army over Taurus, passed the Tigris, took and burned the royal palaces of Asia in the sight of the kings, Tigranocerta, Cabara, Sinope, and Nisibis. But Plutarch notes that the Persians, as if no great harm had befallen them under Cimon, soon after appeared in arms against the Greeks and overcame their numerous forces in Egypt, whereas after Lucullus, Tigranes and Mithridates were able to do nothing. The commander who leaves an adversary almost conquered for his successor deserves more credit than the one who inherits an already weakened enemy. And Cimon, when he took the command, found the power of the king broken and the spirits of the Persians humbled by their great defeats under Themistocles, Pausanias, and Leontychides, whereas Tigranes had never yet been beaten and was flushed with success when he engaged with Lucullus. Plutarch's final judgment is characteristically balanced. All which things being rightly considered, it is a hard matter to give judgment. But he notes that supernatural favor appears to have attended both of them, directing the one what to do, the other what to avoid, and that both have, so to say, the vote of the gods to declare them noble and divine characters. The comparison is not between two men, but between two ages. The age of Cimon, when Greece was united and the enemy was already broken, and the age of Lucullus, when Rome was tearing itself apart and the enemy was still formidable. The moral is that timing matters as much as talent, and that the greatest general is not the one who wins the most battles, but the one who wins them at the right moment. The south wall. Cimon built the south wall of the Acropolis. Lucullus built sea view villas at Naples. Plutarch's portrait of two different ways of spending the spoils of war. The popular table. Cimon's table, open to all at small cost, versus Lucullus's sumptuous oriental one, expensively spread for a few. Plutarch's way of saying that generosity is not the same as extravagance. The vote of the gods, Plutarch's final judgment that both men had supernatural favor. The recognition that merit alone does not explain success. Timing and fortune play their part. Quote, "The better pleasures gained in successful action and effort leave the baser appetites no time or place, and make active and heroic men forget them." Quote, "The commander, as the wrestler, is to be accounted to have done most who leaves an adversary almost conquered for his successor." Quote, "All which things being rightly considered, it is a hard matter to give judgment. For supernatural favor also appears to have attended both of them, directing the one what to do, the other what to avoid, and thus they have, both of them, so to say, the vote of the gods, to declare them noble and divine characters." Nicias. Nicias is Plutarch's portrait of the man who embodied the paradox of Athenian democracy, the wealthy, cautious, superstitious general whose timidity was mistaken for wisdom, and whose destruction was the inevitable consequence of a character unsuited to the times. Plutarch opens with Aristotle's judgment that there had been 3 good citizens eminent above the rest for their hereditary affection and love to the people: Nicias the son of Niceratus, Thucydides the son of Milesius, and Theramenes the son of Hagnon. But the comparison is immediately undercut. Theramenes had his dubious extraction cast in his teeth as a foreigner from Ceos, and his inconstancy obtained him the nickname of the Buskin. Nicias, by contrast, was genuinely well-born, genuinely wealthy, and genuinely respected, and it was precisely these qualities that made him dangerous. The character of Nicias is described with Plutarch's characteristic precision. He was naturally diffident and unhopeful in war, but his good fortune supplied his want of courage and kept it from being detected. His timorousness in civil life, and his extreme dread of accusers, was thought very suitable in a citizen of a free state, and from the people's goodwill towards him got him no small power over them, they being fearful of all that despised them, but willing to promote one who seemed to be afraid of them. The compliment is devastating. The people preferred a leader who feared them to one who despised them, and Nicias's timidity was the foundation of his power. Pericles, who by solid virtue and the pure force of argument ruled the commonwealth, had stood in need of no disguises. Nicias, inferior in every respect, used his riches to gain popularity. Dramatic exhibitions, gymnastic games, and public shows more sumptuous than had been ever known. The religious life of Nicias is the most revealing aspect of his character. He was one of those who dreaded the divine powers extremely, and was much given to arts of divination. He daily sacrificed to the gods, and keeping a diviner at his house, professed to be consulting always about the commonwealth, but for the most part inquired about his own private affairs, more especially concerning his silver mines. The Delian Bridge, the magnificent structure of gilding and coloring that he laid across the channel between Rhenea and Delos, is Plutarch's portrait of the man who could organize a religious festival with exquisite precision, but could not command an army with the same attention. The bridge was a masterpiece of engineering. The Sicilian expedition was a catastrophe of miscalculation. The moral portrait is of a man whose virtues and vices were inseparable. Nicias was generous, pious, and courageous in the conventional sense. He was also timorous, superstitious, and incapable of decisive action when it mattered most. Plutarch records that his timidity was a revenue to rogues and his humanity to honest men. He gave to those who could do him mischief no less than to those who deserved well. The Sicilian expedition, which Thucydides described in such devastating detail, is the catastrophe that Plutarch does not need to retell, since it is already well known. The destruction of the Athenian fleet, the slaughter of the army, and the death of Nicias himself, executed in the quarries of Syracuse. Plutarch's judgment is that Nicias was destroyed not by his enemies, but by his own character, by the timidity that made him hesitate, the superstition that made him prey, and the wealth that made him a target. The bridge at Delos, the magnificent structure of gilding and coloring that Nicias laid across the channel. Plutarch's portrait of the man who could organize a religious festival with exquisite precision but could not command an army. Timidity as revenue. His timidity was a revenue to rogues, and his humanity to honest men. Plutarch's way of saying that generosity born of fear is not true generosity. The diviner at the house. Nishi is keeping a diviner at his house, consulting always about the commonwealth, but for the most part inquiring about his own private affairs. Plutarch's portrait of the man who mistook superstition for piety. Quote, "He was naturally diffident and unhopeful in war, but his good fortune supplied his want of courage, and kept it from being detected, as in all his commands he was constantly successful." Quote, "His timidity was a revenue to rogues, and his humanity to honest men." Crassus. Marcus Crassus is Plutarch's portrait of the man whose avarice was so vast that it became a form of political strategy. The richest man in Rome, whose wealth was built not on inheritance, but on fire and rapine, and whose destruction in Parthia was the inevitable consequence of a character that could never have enough. The opening establishes the paradox. Crassus was educated in a little house together with his two brothers. They kept but one table amongst them, and in respects he lived a more orderly life than any Roman of his time. Yet his avarice was the one vice that darkened all his virtues, and Plutarch records the argument with devastating precision. Whereas at first he was not worth above 300 talents. When he cast up his accounts before going upon his Parthian expedition, he found his possessions to amount to 7,100 talents, most of which he got by fire and rapine, making his advantages of the public calamities. The methods of Crassus's enrichment are described with Plutarch's characteristic clarity. When Sylla seized the city and exposed to sale the goods of those he had caused to be slain, Crassus never refused to accept or give money for them. Observing how extremely subject the city was to fire and falling down of houses, by reason of their height and standing so near together, he bought slaves that were builders and architects, and when he had collected these to the number of more than 500, he made it his practice to buy houses that were on fire, and those in the neighborhood, which the proprietors were willing to part with for little or nothing, so that the greatest part of Rome, at one time or other, came into his hands. Yet for all he had so many workmen, he never built anything but his own house, and used to say that those that were addicted to building would undo themselves soon enough without the help of other enemies. The cave of Vibius Paetianus is Plutarch's most vivid episode in the life. When Cinna and Marius seized power and slew Crassus's father and brother, the young Crassus fled into Spain, where he hid in a cave by the seashore. Vibius Paetianus, learning of his refuge, sent daily provisions but never saw him, and once, taking with him 2 female servants, he showed them the place and bade them go in boldly. When Crassus and his friends saw them, they were afraid of being betrayed, but they answered that they came to wait upon their master, who was hidden in that cave. Crassus, perceiving it was a piece of pleasantry and of goodwill, took them in and kept them there with him as long as he stayed. The episode is Plutarch's portrait of the man who would one day command an army of 40,000 men, hiding in a cave, sustained by the kindness of a stranger, attended by women sent as a joke. The moral portrait is of a man whose avarice was inseparable from his political ambition. Crassus gave loans without interest, but called them in precisely at the time, so that his kindness was often thought worse than the paying the interest would have been. He was hospitable to strangers, kept open house, and never met any citizen, however humble, but he returned him his salute by name. He became one of the best speakers at Rome by pains and industry, outdoing the best natural orators. Yet all of this was driven by a single obsession, the desire to be richer than Pompey and more powerful than Caesar. Plutarch records that Crassus once said no man was to be accounted rich that could not maintain an army at his own cost, a remark that Plutarch contrasts with Marius's distribution of 14 acres a man, and his response when some desired more. God forbid that any Roman should think that too little which is enough to keep him alive and well. The fire-buying slaves, 500 builders and architects, bought to acquire houses that were on fire. Plutarch's portrait of avarice as a military operation. The cave, 8 months hiding in a cave by the seashore, sustained by provisions left near a rock, attended by women sent as a joke. Plutarch's portrait of the man who would one day command the richest army in the world. The cloak. Crassus receiving a cloak from his friend Alexander for the journey, and demanding it back when he came home. Plutarch's portrait of the man who could not part with anything, not even a borrowed garment. Quote, he made it his practice to buy houses that were on fire, and those in the neighborhood, which the proprietors were willing to part with for little or nothing, so that the greatest part of Rome, at one time or other, came into his hands. Quote, no man was to be accounted rich that could not maintain an army at his own cost and charges. The comparison of Crassus with Nicias. The comparison of Crassus with Nicias is Plutarch's final meditation on the paradox of political timidity and political ambition. Two men who were both destroyed by wars they should never have fought, but for opposite reasons. The comparison opens with their estates. Nicias's wealth, though gained by working silver mines, was more honestly got than Crassus's, which was built on the sequestrations of Scylla and the contracts for houses ruined by fire. Crassus publicly and avowedly made use of these arts, as other men do of husbandry and putting out money to interest, while Nicias was never so much as falsely accused of selling his voice in the Senate, or injuring allies, or courting criminals. Nicias was rather laughed at for giving money to those who made a trade of impeachments, merely out of timorousness. The contrast in their management of public affairs is equally sharp. I see not that any dishonesty, injustice, or arbitrary action can be objected to Nicias, who was rather the victim of Alcibiades' tricks and was always careful and scrupulous in his dealings with the people. But Crassus is very generally blamed for his changeableness in his friendships and enmities, his unfaithfulness, and his mean and underhand proceedings. He himself could not deny that to compass the consulship he hired men to lay violent hands upon Domitius and Cato. Yet Plutarch adds the essential counterpoint. While Crassus was to be blamed for his violent and arbitrary courses, Nicias was no less to be blamed for his timorousness and meanness of spirit, which made him submit and give in to the basest people. Crassus, having to do not with such as Cleon or Hyperbolus, but with the splendid acts of Caesar and the 3 triumphs of Pompey, would not stoop, but bravely bore up against their joint interests. The military comparison is the heart of the comparison. Nicias's experience and sound judgment as a general saved him from being carried away by the delusive hopes of his fellow citizens, and made him refuse to entertain any prospect of conquering Sicily. Crassus, on the other hand, mistook in entering on a Parthian war as an easy matter. He was eager, while Caesar was subduing the West, to advance for his part to the east and the Indian Sea. Plutarch notes the irony. Those who praise Alexander's enterprise and blame that of Crassus judge of the beginning unfairly by the results. In actual service, Nicias did much that deserves high praise. He frequently defeated the enemy in battle and was on the very point of capturing Syracuse. Crassus, on the other hand, committed so many errors as not to leave fortune room to show him favor. Plutarch's final judgment is characteristically balanced. The Athenians sent out Nicias against his will to the war, and Crassus led out the Romans against theirs. Crassus brought misfortune on Rome, as Athens brought it on Nicias. But there is still ground for praising Nicias rather than for finding fault with Crassus, since Nicias was right about the difficulty of the enterprise, even if he lacked the courage to resist it. Crassus was wrong about the ease of the enterprise, and his eagerness for glory led him to destruction. One scrupulously observed, the other entirely slighted, the arts of the diviner. And the comparison ends with Plutarch's recognition that both men were destroyed not by their enemies, but by their own characters. The fire buyer and the miner. Nicias's silver mines, gained by honest labor though involving suffering, versus Crassus's fire buying, gained by taking advantage of public calamity. Plutarch's way of saying that even avarice has degrees. The timid and the bold. Nicias was right about Sicily, but too timid to resist. Crassus was wrong about Parthia, but too bold to hesitate. Plutarch's portrait of 2 forms of political failure. The diviner. One scrupulously observed, the other entirely slighted, the arts of the diviner. Plutarch's final contrast between the man who feared the gods and the man who ignored them. Quote, "If we compare this with the sequestrations of Scylla and the contracts for houses ruined by fire, we shall then think Nicias came very honestly by his money." Quote, "Crassus, though always ambitious of command, never attained to it, except by mere necessity in the Servile War, Pompey and Metellus, and the two brothers Lucullus being absent." Quote, "One scrupulously observed, the other entirely slighted, the arts of the diviner." Conclusion. The 14 pairs of Plutarch's parallel lives constitute a single sustained argument about the relationship between private character and public action. The argument proceeds through a series of contrasts: free will against necessity, virtue against fortune, austerity against luxury, justice against ambition, and reaches its conclusion not in any single life, but in the pattern that emerges across all 14. The founders established the principle that political institutions are expressions of individual character. The warriors test the relationship between military genius and political wisdom. The statesmen explore the tension between public virtue and private life. The final pairs examine the consequences of ambition, avarice, and timidity. Together, they compose a moral philosophy conducted through biography, a philosophy in which the test of a man's character is not what he achieves, but what he becomes. Key persons discussed: Plutarch, c. 8045 to 120, the author of the Parallel Lives, a moralist rather than an historian, whose purpose is moral instruction through the comparison of great men. Arthur Hugh Clough, 1819 to 1861, the editor of the Dryden translation, whose introduction frames the entire edition with the thesis that Plutarch is a moralist, not a historian. Theseus, the founder hero of Athens, prototype of the virtuous citizen ruler who acts of his own motion. Romulus, the founder of Rome, whose reign of force contrasts with Theseus's reign of law. Lycurgus, the lawgiver of Sparta, whose austerity created the harshest but most enduring of Greek constitutions. Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, whose piety and learning contrast with Lycurgus's severity. Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, whose moderate reforms balance the claims of rich and poor. Poplicola, the Roman consul who defended the Republic after the expulsion of the kings. Themistocles, the Athenian admiral whose naval genius defeated Persia at Salamis. Camillus, the Roman general who defended the Republic against the Gauls. Pericles, the Athenian statesman who ruled by solid virtue and the pure force of argument. Fabius Maximus, the Roman general whose cautious strategy saved the Republic from Hannibal. Alcibiades, the brilliant and treacherous Athenian whose genius destroyed his city. Coriolanus, the Roman patrician whose pride and contempt for the people led to his exile. Timoleon, the Corinthian who liberated Syracuse from tyranny. Aemilius Paulus, the Roman general who conquered Macedon. Pelopidas, the Theban general whose courage restored Theban power. Marcellus, the Roman general who captured Syracuse. Aristides, the Athenian statesman called the Just, whose integrity contrasts with Cato's severity. Marcus Cato, the Roman statesman whose austerity and discipline embodied the old Roman virtues. Philopoemen, the Achaean general called the last of the Greeks, whose soldierly virtue contrasted with Flamininus's political ambition. Flamininus, the Roman general who proclaimed the freedom of Greece. Pyrrhus, the Epirot king whose military genius and political instability contrasted with Marius's relentless ambition. Caius Marius, the Roman general whose rise from obscurity to power ended in tyranny. Lysander, the Spartan admiral whose ambition destroyed the Athenian democracy and corrupted Sparta itself. Lucius Cornelius Sylla, the Roman dictator whose military genius and political ruthlessness established the precedent for Caesar's seizure of power. Cimon, the Athenian general who liberated the Aegean from Persian domination. Lucius Lucullus, the Roman general whose campaigns against Mithridates were followed by a retirement into luxury. Nicias, the Athenian general whose timidity and superstition led to the catastrophic Sicilian expedition. Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome, whose avarice led to the disastrous Parthian expedition. Key works discussed. Parallel Lives, Plutarch, the primary source. A collection of paired Greek and Roman biographies with comparisons, composed in the 2nd century AD. History of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides' reference for the lives of Themistocles, Pericles, Alcibiades, and Nicias. History of Rome. Livy reference for the lives of Romulus, Camillus, Coriolanus, and Fabius. Athenian Constitution. Aristotle reference for the lives of Solon, Themistocles, and Aristides. Annals. Tacitus reference for the historical context of the Roman imperial period. Republic. Plato reference for the philosophical framework of virtue, justice, and the ideal state. Commentaries on his own life. Sylla reference for the life of Sylla and Lucullus. Index of key concepts. Eurety, excellence/virtue, the central concept of Plutarch's moral philosophy. The quality of being at one's best, whether in war, governance, or private life. Fortune, Tyche, the role of chance and fate in human affairs. Plutarch's recognition that merit alone does not explain success. Paideia, education/culture, the formation of character through learning, discipline, and exposure to the arts. Phronesis, practical wisdom, the ability to make sound judgments in particular situations, the quality that distinguishes the effective statesman from the merely virtuous. Synoikismos, unification, the political act of bringing fun-signed communities together, the foundational act of the Greek polis. Eunomia, good order, the condition of a well-governed state, the goal of the lawgiver and the statesman. Eleutheria, freedom, the condition of self-governance, the prize that the Greek and Roman heroes fought to preserve. Daimons, intermediary beings, Plutarch's Platonic belief in beings of a middle nature between divine and human, who connect the moral lives of great men to a larger cosmic order. Croesus, the proper use of wealth, power, and opportunity, the test of practical wisdom. Cosmiotes, orderliness, the quality of a well-ordered life, the principle that governs Plutarch's portrait of Numa and Lycurgus. Reading comprehension questions. 1. How does Plutarch's method of using anecdote as evidence differ from the modern biographical method of using documentary sources? What are the advantages and limitations of each approach? 2. Plutarch states that his interest is less for politics and the changes of empires, and much more for personal character and individual actions. How does this principle shape the structure and content of each life? 3. In the comparison of Theseus and Romulus, Plutarch draws a fundamental distinction between the founder who acts of free will and the founder who acts of necessity. How does this distinction apply to the other pairs in the collection? 4. Plutarch records that Lycurgus and Numa both used religion as a political instrument, but in opposite ways. Lycurgus through severity, Numa through gentleness. How does this contrast illuminate the relationship between religion and political power? 5. The comparison of Aristides and Marcus Cato examines two forms of austerity, the Athenians' justice and the Roman severity. Which form does Plutarch consider more admirable, and why? 6. Plutarch notes that both Lysander and Sylla were destroyed by ambition, but in opposite ways, Lysander through the corruption of Sparta, Sylla through the seizure of Rome. How does this contrast illuminate the relationship between private ambition and public consequence? 7. In the comparison of Nicias and Crassus, Plutarch argues that one was right about the difficulty of the enterprise but too timid to resist it, while the other was wrong about the ease of the enterprise but too bold to hesitate. How does this contrast illuminate the relationship between judgment and courage? 8. Plutarch's belief in daimons, beings of a middle nature between divine and human, shapes his understanding of the relationship between character and fate. How does this belief manifest in the lives, and what role does it play in Plutarch's moral philosophy? 9. Clough argues that Plutarch's unhistorical treatment is a deliberate choice, not a flaw. How does this argument apply to the lives you have read, And what does it reveal about the relationship between historical accuracy and moral truth? 10. If you were to add a 15th pair to Plutarch's parallel lives, which two figures, one Greek, one Roman, would you choose, and what moral quality would you use to organize the comparison? Explain your choice in terms of Plutarch's method.